Fire Emblem Fates Conquest is already a difficult game on Lunatic difficulty, so is it even possible to complete if all player characters have 0 strength and 0 magic? To answer this question, I have decided to challenge myself by modding my game so that all player characters have a magic and strength cap of 0. This means that their strength and magic stats will always be 0 and they can never gain any permanent stats through level ups, class changes, or even stat boosters. However, other bonuses from skills, tonics, meals, pair-ups, and so on will still function as normal. All enemies are unchanged and are identical to their base game equivalents, but any captured units will have their strength and magic reduced to 0 once they are under player control. With all player units having 0 strength and 0 magic, damage will be based entirely on weapon might, skill setups, and various other temporary bonuses, buffs, and debuffs, so my success in this run will largely be dictated by how well I can utilize Fates' various systems to their fullest extent. I am not certain if completing the game is even possible under these restrictions, but I guess we'll find out. As such, because of the untested nature of this challenge, I will not be doing this as an Iron Man, and so I will save and reload as necessary to explore different strategies and pursue better outcomes. To further add to the difficulty, or rather to not reduce it, I will avoid using DLC, path bonuses, or other similar content unless the run literally cannot proceed without it. Because each chapter will be different from the very beginning, I opt not to use the Branch of Fate, and instead I start the game from the very beginning. Though once I beat chapter 5, I will be free to use Branch of Fate if I deem it to be necessary. So with this, I begin the game on Lunatic Classic difficulty. For my avatar, I create a male Corrin with a plus defense boon, minus magic bane, and an Oni Savage talent. Since strength and magic cannot be reduced below 0, the minus magic bane will afford me no further penalties. In chapter 1 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we get Corrin who has 0 strength and 0 magic. The objective of this map is to defeat Xander, who is well known for having high defense, so it will not be unreasonable to think that this map is already impossible. But curiously, Xander only has 1 defense on this map, meaning that even a Corrin with 0 strength and a bronze sword can damage him. But because of Xander's personal skill Chivalry, he takes less damage if his opponent is at full health, so Corrin can only do 1 damage per hit. We can triple Corrin's damage output by attacking while Corrin is wounded, but defeating Xander too quickly is actually not desirable, because that will mean Corrin will get less XP for battling him. So I decided to repeatedly hit Xander for 1 damage at a time to gain some early levels, and I managed to level up Corrin twice, gaining 0 strength and 0 magic for a total of 0 strength and 0 magic, which is exactly on par with the expected values. In chapter 2 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, Corrin is commanded to execute Kaze and Rinka, though how he will do so is an open question considering his stats. This map is normally an afterthought, but in this challenge it actually becomes quite formidable. Here we get Gunter who has 0 strength and Felicia who has 0 strength and 0 magic. Pre-round split Gunter is useful for his high defense, and Felicia has incredible versatility due to her skills, healing, and dagger debuffs. This is a route map where we face 6 enemies, all of whom are now much harder to kill because it is difficult to deal damage when your characters have 0 strength. I open the map by having Corrin activate the Dragon Vein to access the healing tiles within. As enemies approach, I have Gunter leverage his high defense to block the right side, and then place Felicia adjacent to further buff his defense with Demoiselle. After the first samurai moves into attack, Gunter is able to counter with a Felicia pair-up, applying her dagger debuff and reducing the enemy's defense to 0. This makes it possible for me to follow up and defeat him on the next turn. I then move Corrin to block the left side, making use of Felicia's personal skill and Demoiselle to give him 4 damage reduction, making him incredibly durable. Unfortunately, on the next turn, Rinka moves around to try to flank us, so I take out the second samurai and use the exit as a choke point. Luckily, Kaze attacks Felicia, getting himself debuffed, decreasing his already low defense, and allowing me to pile damage onto him to defeat him on the next turn. Corrin just barely managed to survive 2 attacks from the remaining enemies, but I'm able to retreat and take some time to heal. Notably, healing is much weaker than normal because Felicia has 0 magic. As I fall back, the enemies split up, allowing me to divide and conquer, and soon I only have Rinka to deal with, but she is actually incredibly threatening. She has 9 defense, a 2 ranged weapon, as well as a personal skill that boosts her damage by 4 when she is wounded. Without using skills or debuffs, I actually cannot do any damage to her. Her damage also outpaces my healing, so I have to repeatedly debuff her with Felicia and constantly shuffle everyone around out of the healing healing terrain to spread out the damage taken. It takes quite a while, but eventually after 10 minutes of dealing chip damage, Rinka finally goes down. With 0 strength and magic, previously easy foes are elevated to raid boss levels, and my experience on this normally trivial introductory map is not but a sign of ill tidings to come. In chapter 3 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, our task is to capture a fort near the bottomless canyon. To assist us, we get the help of Hans, who is a green unit that has a freakish 12 strength. That said, it doesn't really do much for him because he charges over the bridge and is immediately killed by archers. I try to have Korin tackle this bridge fort, which is defended by several units. With all my defensive buffs, Korin takes 0 damage from the archers and minimal damage from the pair of enemy occupying the fort. Unfortunately, Korin's damage output is also low. I try to force my way through, but even with a total plus 5 damage from Gunter's para bonus and personal skill, I find that I do not have enough damage to outpace the fort's passive healing and enemy shield gauge activations. Instead, I use the Dragon Vein to attack the fort from behind, allowing Korin to move past them and occupy the fort, which denies the enemy's healing and lets me slowly kill them over the course of the next few dozen turns. After taking out the remaining enemies one by one, I trigger the reinforcements, which are 3 Sky Knights that ignore Korin entirely because he has too much defense. Instead, they all go after Felicia, so I have to desperately chase after them before they can group up and kill her. Now, only the boss remains, and he does less damage to Korin than Korin does to him. I take the opportunity to use up Felicia's heal staff for XP, and then kill the boss to complete the map in only 232 turns. In the next cutscene, Gunter is thrown off the bridge to his seeming demise, but perhaps he could have held on if only he didn't have 0 strength. In chapter 4 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we face a route map against a large number of faceless. We don't have access to Felicia on this map, and instead we get Kaze, who has 0 strength, and Rinka, who has 0 strength. In this challenge, Kaze and Rinka are pretty much completely useless before the route split because enemies now have way too much defense for them to be able to do anything. Fortunately, we have access to Ryoma, a monstrous green unit with 17 strength that can kill any enemy that he chooses to fight. Ryoma moves ahead by himself, defeating many enemies, but notably, after he reaches the upper left, he will not try to attack the boss. Unfortunately, the boss faceless has steel defense and steel strength, meaning that he can kill any of your units in 2 to 3 hits, while you struggle to do any damage at all. While debuffs cannot reduce your stats into the negatives, they can cancel out any strength buffs you might get from pair-ups or other sources. Since we don't have control of a healer on this map, it's basically impossible to do enough damage to defeat the boss before being slaughtered. I give it a try, but I can barely make a dent in him before all my units are killed. So I try a different tactic. If I can make it to Sakura and ensure that she survives, then maybe she can provide enough healing to overcome the boss. However, I find that it's nearly impossible to actually reach her in time to save her. Ryoma moves through the map too slowly on his own, and Korin simply cannot move as fast as he normally should be able to because killing enemies takes way too much time. The only way to reach them in time is to activate the Dragon Vein near the boss, but that has some major downsides such as being killed by the boss. On the next attempt, I try to lure the boss to fight Ryoma, but find that Ryoma will prioritize defeating normal enemies over the boss, which leads me to believe that he will straight up never initiate combat against the boss under any circumstance, and that he is perfectly content to watch as Kaze, Rinka, and Korin are brutally murdered right in front of him. Since I can't out-damage or out-tank the boss, I have no choice but to keep trying alternative methods. In normal circumstances, the boss would never attack Ryoma over a player unit because Ryoma would kill him on the counterattack. However, using the Dragon Veins that provides access to the boss puts you inside his range, making it very hard to separate Korin from him. So I decided to use a bit of a terrain trick by luring the boss while standing on a forest tile. This way, the retreating unit's movement is not penalized by the forest, while the faceless's movement is, giving me the slight bit of space I need to disengage and get out of range. With no other targets nearby, the boss chooses to attack Ryoma and dies on the counter. With this settled, in true Birthright fashion, I rely on Ryoma to kill all the remaining enemies, which completes the map. In chapter 5 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, after an accidental matricide, Korin transforms into a feral dragon which boosts his stats but makes him unable to pair up. For this map, we get Sakura, who has 0 magic, and Azura, who has 0 strength. Sakura is a temporary healer used only on this map because she does not appear in the Conquest route, and Azura is practically identical and functions to normal fates. This is a route map where an allied Ryoma faces off against a mysterious figure, a fight that he will very likely lose. While Ryoma fights the boss, we fight a mixed variety of dark mages and mercenaries, some of whom are armed with Wyrmslayers, which are very dangerous against Korin. I open the map by moving towards the lower right. I immediately dive onto the Wyrmslayer enemy by piling on debuffs and then defeat him by having Korin attack twice, by using Azura's action refresh. With the most threatening enemy gone, the remaining foes are easy to dispatch over the course of the next few turns. This handles battles the first group, and after Ryoma inevitably loses his duel, I move south. Unfortunately, once you approach the boss, another group of 2 mercenaries and 3 dark mages become aggressive, and at the same time, 4 more dark mages spawn in as reinforcements from the corners of the map. Simply put, I don't have enough damage to kill them before they kill me, especially because Corrin cannot counterattack at 2 range. Furthermore, since they spawn from multiple directions, there's not really any effective places I can use as a choke point. In desperation, I try an extreme tactic where I sacrifice Rinka as bait to trigger the reinforcements and then try to make a choke point in the lower right. Unfortunately, Sakura's healing is very weak because she has 0 magic, and it's simply not enough to overcome the sheer amount of magic damage I take from the mages. With my current setup, it's basically impossible to fight against the second set of enemies effectively. I theorized that the scuffed choke point method could probably work with a plus resistance boon Corrin that leveled resistance on every single level up, but restarting the run for something so tenuous and uncertain will be an absolute last resort, especially since Fate's level ups cannot really be RNG abused. Instead, I turn to the ultimate crutch, Ryoma. Normally, Ryoma will lose his fight against the mysterious figure because he dies in 2 hits while needing to land 8 to win, all the while having a very shaky hit chance and extremely questionable dodge rate. It is very unlikely, but it has been previously documented that it is possible for him to win, and once he wins, in theory he will move around and kill all the remaining enemies. Now, how likely is it for Ryoma to actually win? And the answer to that is actually surprisingly difficult to calculate because of Vantage, Duelist Flow, and several other hidden mechanics. Namely, Ryoma is hard-coded to dodge all attacks for the first 2 turns, and while he has a display crit chance, he will never crit the boss. Modeling this based on probabilities is very complicated because of all the moving parts and special interactions. To assess the actual probability of success, a simulation is a more viable alternative, so I took some time to write a Python script to run a million simulations of the battle, and if my calculations are correct, Ryoma will only win the battle roughly 1.5% of the time. Anyway, while playing this map, I was completely unaware of the actual chances of Ryoma winning, aside from knowing that it was low. After several attempts where Ryoma didn't get anywhere close to winning, I started using save states to try to boost the odds, but even those aren't a guaranteed win. Fate's RNG is not very easily manipulable, and unlike the GBA games, arrow dancing will not progress the RN state. The most practical way to abuse RNG is to manually progress the random numbers through combat, so even if you save state, you can only affect the outcome so much. I keep resetting until I get a very good streak of Ryoma hits and dodges, and then I make a save state. With every failed subsequent attempt, I load the save state and try to progress the RN list until I eventually run out of safe actions to perform entirely. But finding another lucky starting state will simply take even more time, so I decided to commit and go all in. So then I sacrifice Azura to burn even more RNs, which guarantees Ryoma's 8th hit and allows him to win the fight. With this, Ryoma is free to roam around the map, but this also triggers enemy aggression as well as the mage reinforcements. Now, my objective is simply to survive, but doing that is easier said than done. Because of the actions I took while burning RNs, I'm in a more precarious spot than I would like, and Azura is dead. While she will come back after the route split, her absence is a big reduction to both my offensive and defensive capabilities. Fortunately, I was able to catch one of the reinforcement mages by trapping him at spawn, but all the remaining enemies will be much more difficult to kill. Fortunately, Ryoma catches up and starts slaughtering enemies left and right like a slasher villain. And while he cleaves through the enemies like a scythe through hay, I'm still barely hanging on by a thread, and I am forced to sacrifice Rinka to block a Wyrmslayer Myrmidon. But I still need more time, so I also use Kaze as a human shield, and his life buys me enough distance to get away, allowing Ryoma to obliterate the final enemies and complete the map. After around 30 total attempts and several dead characters, we have finally finished the introduction of Fire Emblem Fates, none of which is actually part of the Conquest route. In Chapter 6 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we finally begin the Conquest route and get Corrin, who has 0 strength and magic, and Felicia, who has 0 strength and magic. Felicia is a useful and unique unit because she starts as a promoted class, and as a result, she can get both skills much more quickly than most other characters. Corrin is extremely useful in the early and mid game as a Dragonstone tank. On top of providing defensive stats, the Dragonstone deals magic damage and has high base might, allowing Corrin to deal more than 0 damage against most early game enemies. We also get all the Norian Royals, each with 0 strength and magic. For now, they are all temporary units that cannot trade or level up. In other words, you can use their items freely and let them die with no consequences. I moved down immediately with most of my units to fight Takumi and Hinoka. Because Takumi has low resistance, Leo can actually do some decent damage despite having 0 magic, but on player phase, he misses a 79% and dies soon after. I managed to take out Takumi with Corrin and Camilla, but this is at the cost of Elise, who was one rounded by Hinoka on the next turn. Hinoka is now no longer a threat because my remaining units have higher defense, but defeating her takes a lot more effort than expected. I have Xander run past Ryoma, who he has no chance of defeating while having 0 strength, and instead have him target Sakura. Xander strikes and is able to secure the kill, but nearly dies to Ryoma on the next turn. I have him run to draw Ryoma away, which then lets me lure Yukimura to defeat him and complete the map. Even now, it is already apparent that typical combat dynamics have drastically changed. It will be quite typical to need at least 3 to 5 rounds of combat, if not more, to defeat any enemy. In Chapter 7 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we get Silas, who has 0 strength, and Elise, who has 0 magic. Silas has a surprising amount of bonus damage through Vow of Friendship and Elbow Room, and Elise is incredibly useful because of her personal skill, Lily's Poise. We also get Arthur, who has 0 strength, and Effie, who has 0 strength. Arthur will mainly be useful as a strength pair-up bot, while Effie is an early game tank that unfortunately will fall off. In this map, we face a large number of faceless, who have middling defense, meaning that most of my characters cannot do any damage. And since defeating enemies will be slow, I simply have to ensure that I can survive for as long as possible. I begin the map by using a defense tonic on Corrin, and use the path below the starting area as a choke point. By stacking Felicia's personal skill and Lily's Poise, I'm able to get enough damage reduction that Corrin takes 0 damage from the faceless, allowing me to survive indefinitely. On the other side, I pair Silas with Effie, and I keep her healed with Elise. Of particular note is the boss, who has higher damage, Grizzly Wound, and Savage Blow, meaning that attacks from him are much more deadly. Fortunately, Effie's low damage output means that she can't kill the enemies fast enough to give the boss enough space to attack. Once the top area is cleared by Corrin, I shuffle my characters around, causing the boss to move in. Fortunately, with an Effie pair-up and all the other buffs, Corrin actually gets enough defense to take 0 damage from the boss, allowing me to defeat him over the course of several turns. I feed the remaining enemies to Felicia and Effie to spread out my XP and complete the map on my first try, which is rather surprising. In Chapter 8 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we get Odin, who has 0 magic, and Niles, who has 0 strength. Odin isn't too useful, while Niles' capture ability will be of extreme importance for the success of this challenge. This map's side objective is to visit at least 3 out of 5 houses to get a maximum reward of 10,000 gold. In the early game, while enemy stats are still low, you can do a surprising amount of damage even with 0 strength if you leverage enough game mechanics. To handle the dark mages on this map, I give Felicia a steel dagger, strength tonic, and an Arthur pair-up, allowing her to defeat dark mages in 2 rounds. To handle the axe fighters, I have Corrin use his Dragonstone with a magic tonic, giving him the ability to 2-shot the low resistance melee enemies. With this, I have a solution for the 2 main enemy types of this chapter. I begin the map by pushing left as quickly as I can. If you manage to knock out all of the enemies blocking the way, Elise can reach the bottom left house as early as turn 3 and then immediately grab the middle left house by turn 4. The enemy lancers that visit houses have weird passive AI, so Elise can move around them without being attacked. With the money and villages secure, my next goal is to clear the mages and the fighters. Felicia can handle the magic enemies with her high resistance, and Corrin can handle the physical enemies because of his high defense. I use the Dragon Vein to ensure I don't get surrounded and clean up the remaining enemies with relative ease. Now, the only challenge that remains is the boss, Kilma, who has several concerning characteristics. He has passive regen from the gate tile he stands on, and lifesteal from his Nosferatu tome. If I don't do some preparation, then it's possible that I won't be able to do enough damage and outpace his healing. So to make absolutely sure I can get the kill, I give Felicia as many strength and resistance bonuses as I physically can, and I even made plans to swap between the iron and steel daggers to alternate their debuff types to both get the higher defense debuff from the steel dagger as well as applying a magic debuff with the iron dagger. But I soon find that this much preparation was actually extreme overkill. Once I finally started attacking Kilma, something I didn't expect was that Kilma's accuracy with Nosferatu is actually horrible because of weapon triangle disadvantage, and so I just killed him in 3 rounds without him ever being able to use it to recover any health. At this point, the run was going unexpectedly well, so I decided to think more about plans for the endgame, in particular defeating the final boss. Corrin will be crucial towards defeating Takumi, and my original talent choice of Oni Savage doesn't do much to help with that. Since I was still early on in the run, I felt comfortable restarting from Branch of Fate to change to a class that has more actual utility. So I began the run again, this time using a female Corrin with a plus defense boon, minus magic bane, and a samurai talent, primarily for useful damage skills such as sword fair and life and death. By picking a female Corrin instead of Felicia, we start with Jacob, who has 0 strength and magic. Jacob is similar to Felicia in that he can obtain advanced skills more quickly, but he also produces an additional child unit, Dwyer, who is very easy to recruit. I start the run again, and chapters 6, 7, and 8 go mostly the same as they did in my previous run with few deviations. With this, we begin chapter 9 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic. Here, we get Azura, who has 0 strength, and Nyx, who has 0 magic. Azura is a dancer with obvious ridiculously high utility, while Nyx probably does not have a usable niche in this challenge. I start the map by moving down to recruit Nyx and then break through the wall with Corrin at the front. I take care to not trigger the reinforcements as I move in to lure the enemy spearfighters. While Corrin's defense is quite good, some of the spearfighters have seal defense, so she is not invincible. That said, the situation is quite manageable as long as I only fight a few enemies at a time. After clearing the initial enemies, I move everyone to the right side of the map to join with Azura. I prepare to trigger the reinforcements and think about trying to block some of them by occupying the stairs, but I mess up and trigger them too soon, which is potentially disastrous. Fortunately, many of these reinforcements spawn within range of this map's Dragon Rain effect, which triggers Acid Rain that drops all units within range to 1 HP. While most of my units can't do much damage, many can do at least 1, allowing me to score many easy kills on the reinforcements and stabilize the situation. I fall back and tank the remaining enemies with Corrin and FE until I eventually manage to grind through all of them. I spend some time training Azura, and she actually gets some very good defense level ups, which is quite rare. I use hit and run attacks to take out the archers in the boss's room and then move to capture Haitaka. Haitaka is a very useful enemy to capture because he is the earliest source of rally defense, which will be extremely useful in upcoming chapters. Unfortunately, Haitaka is on a throne, granting him a total of 15 effective defense. This is high enough that Niles will struggle to do any damage, making this a difficult capture. I deal chip damage with Corrin and luckily manage to get Haitaka down to exactly 1 HP. Fortunately, after debuffs and buffs have been applied, Niles can actually double Haitaka with an iron bow for 1 damage per hit, even though his accuracy is garbage. With a dance and a heal, I have 4 opportunities to land a 50% hit, so I just go for it. The first attack misses, but the second lands, capturing Haitaka and securing a critical unit for the next chapter. In chapter 10 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we face one of the toughest chapters in the series with a much weaker army than normal. Last chapter, we captured Haitaka, who now has 0 strength and magic. Haitaka is a solid early unit because of his great bulk and useful skills. Since I'm worried about this map in particular, I early promote him for an instant power boost. I try to make sure that my frontline units get a plus defense buff from the mess hall and then provide HP and defense tonics to basically everyone to improve survivability. I open the map by immediately using the fire orbs and ballista, which do damage independent of stats, making their functionality unchanged in this run. Their accuracy isn't too good, but by using them, I'm able to considerably reduce the HP of the initial enemy groups before they even reach me. To secure my 2 flanks, I send Silas to the left and FE to the right. Silas's role is to secure the house or treasure and stall some Oni savages, while FE's role is mainly to body block the archers on the bridge. On turn 3, we get reinforcements in the form of Selena, who has 0 strength, Baruka, who has 0 strength, and Camilla, who has 0 strength and magic. Selena lacks standout features, but Baruka's personal skill and class makes her surprisingly useful in this challenge. Camilla, just like in the base game, is a great unit, and in this challenge, her personal skill, Rose's Thorns, is especially useful as a damage buff. Using strategies that I worked out over the course of several attempts, I moved to immediately seize the villages. After moving down to clear some enemies, I immediately moved Camilla over to the right and have Azura sing to move her directly to the Draco Shield village. Unfortunately, this gives me no time to get the duo club, but that's not really a high priority. Oboro attacks Camilla and several other units move to block her, but I'm able to have her lunge a Sky Knight to move out of the trap. I manage to clean up the enemies that were softened up by the siege weapons, but soon a second wave starts approaching. Several flyers try to move past me, but I'm able to shoot them down quite easily with effective bow damage. On the sides, enemies start piling up. On the right, FE is able to hold the choke, but on the left, Silence starts being pushed back by the Oni savages. At this point, Takumi will drain the water from the port, which opens up the central area, making it much more difficult to defend. So once Takumi activates the Dragon Vein, I immediately fall back with everyone to the final defense point. In a regular playthrough, at this point, you have to really start managing the enemy count, because if you don't, then they will start to pile up and become incredibly threatening as they start surrounding you. But with my low damage output, killing enemies quickly is not only not an option, it is in fact an impossibility. Instead, my priority is to make sure that everyone can somehow live through being attacked by multiple enemies at once for several turns, and to make a formation as resilient against lunge. The selection for units that can serve as a frontline actually winds up being a bit tricky. While Baruka and Camilla are quite tanky, they can't be used as the front units in a pair-up because of the large number of bow enemies. So my plan ends up being to make a 2-rank formation with Corrin, Haitaka, Selena, and FE in front, with my weaker units in the back. By making the formation 2 ranks deep, individual lunge enemies cannot break through immediately to cause an instant game over. I place Corrin and FE on the exposed corners as they have the highest defense and put Hayataka and Selena in the middle. Hayataka's central position lets him buff nearly everyone with rally defense, and his high HP more than makes up for his relatively low defense. Selena isn't too tanky, but her high speed allows her to double and charge shield gauge quickly, making her surprisingly resilient. As I blockade the defense point, I find that some unexpected Sky Knight AI behavior has worked out in my favor. Some of the flying units have special AI that prioritizes seizing over attacking, and several of them have moved in a way that blocks enemies from attacking, reducing the amount of damage I take per turn. I managed to survive the initial impact, and once the first two layers of the enemies settle in, the struggle continues with no change in the status quo, meaning that if I can survive one turn, I can probably survive the next. More and more enemies continue piling in, and under normal circumstances, this could be quite troubling. But in this case, they all just hang around uselessly on the outskirts. And with this, I just survive until the turn limit expires, and I have done it. I have beaten Chapter 10 of Conquest on Lunatic difficulty with 0 strength and magic while suffering 0 casualties. Next up in Conquest with 0 strength and magic is the Mozu Paralogue. Normally this chapter is played earlier, but after several attempts, I found it to be nearly impossible to reach Mozu without flying units, because ground units are slowed significantly by Faceless blocking the way. Here we get Mozu who has 0 strength. Mozu is a particularly useful unit because of her high speed, bow utility, and access to a wide variety of damage skills. Bows are also probably one of the best weapon types in this challenge because of their high might and effective damage against flyers. I handle the map by sending flyers over to Mozu immediately and then spend most of the map training her, and she reaches level 9, gaining 0 strength for a total of 0 strength. I then move on to Chapter 11 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic. I decide to deploy a captured Sky Knight from Chapter 10, but frankly, those captured units are just fresh bodies with no practical long-term use. This map is structured around entering and clearing rooms, which can be a bit tricky to handle. Since the space is very cramped, it's easy for the enemies to focus down your weaker characters. So often the best way to deal with the rooms is to send in a single strong unit that can kill everyone inside. Fortunately, Dragonstone Torin fits the bill due to her overwhelming defense. I have her defeat everyone in Rinka's Oni Savage room and then move out a couple units to lure out Azama's Hexing Rod. I then deal with the Diviners in the next room with Jacob, whose resistance is good enough to take minimal damage. I then turn my focus to the middle room, which is trickier than the rest because of enemies with lunge and a variety of high damage attackers, including a pair of samurai that have the life and death skill. I send in Corrin with all the defense buffs I can, but unfortunately my initial move was too aggressive and Corrin got lunged out of range of the stairs, cutting off her retreat. So to salvage the situation, I sent in a generic Sky Knight as a sacrifice to distract the enemies from the main character, allowing me to just barely escape. I continue launching hit and run attacks with Corrin, which slowly wears the enemy down. I'm able to keep Corrin healthy by retreating across the stairs, but the enemies inside will accrue damage because the room does not have a healer. After some time, I clear all the enemies and capture one of the life and death samurai, even though there's probably no practical use case for this low level unit. I then clear the remaining rooms. Kaze and his ninjas are easily handled by Corrin because she takes no damage from them, and Sechina's counter archers aren't a big threat because Corrin's damage output is too low for the counter skill to really do anything. I then move to the boss room, which is staffed by Hanoka and a bunch of stationary units. Since the enemies don't move, this is a perfect opportunity to feed XP into Mozu. With buffs from Elise, Camilla, and Jacob, Mozu is able to do a non-zero amount of damage, and after squeezing all the XP I can out of these units, Mozu reaches level 14, gaining 0 strength for a total of 0 strength. In between chapters, I take a quick detour to Invasion 1 where I focus on getting support ranks, and little else, because my units are too high level to gain any XP on this map. I then start Chapter 12 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, where we face a considerable challenge with a time-limited map where we have 16 turns to either escape or defeat Ryoma. Unfortunately, defeating Ryoma in a timely fashion is probably impossible for this challenge. Any chapter with a time limit is potentially lethal because even in the best of circumstances, my units will progress slowly compared to a normal playthrough because of the increased number of turns I need to take out enemies. Kaze joined at the end of Chapter 11, and he has 0 strength. He's useful mainly for access to Poison Strike, which is one of several skills that does % HP damage at the end of combat, independent of your stats. And in this challenge, figuring out a way to stack % HP damage will be absolutely critical to the success of the run. For this map, we get Laszlo, who has 0 strength, and Perry, who has 0 strength. Laszlo has a useful personal skill that acts as a small strength and speed rally, while Perry has a clean criminal record because her stats indicate that it's exceedingly unlikely that she has or ever will kill anybody. In the battle preps, I class change Jacob into a Master of Arms to work towards life and death, and promote Arthur to get a larger pair of strength bonus. The typical method for clearing this map leads you through the center, fighting through the majority of the enemies to get more XP and treasure. I tried this at first, but with my reduced damage output, I found that going this way was way too slow, making it very difficult to reach the escape point by the time limit. So instead, my plan was to move everyone through the sides of the map to avoid combat as much as possible. This map features a wide variety of medicinal pots that can be broken to provide either buffs or debuffs to units within their range. Each of these pots has a predetermined effect, allowing you to plan their use in advance. I start the map by grouping everyone up and breaking a nearby pot to grant most of my units +4 defense and then move everyone through the left side. Normally, people fight through the central area to obtain the Flame Shuriken, which is a magic throwing weapon and a one-of-a-kind weapon in this route. So to obtain it, I lure Saizo into attacking me across the wall, and once he's in position, I have a mega buff from Mozu take him out, which secures the loot. I then move past the inner sanctum, which is full of apothecaries and pots, skipping that area entirely, and move into the upper left room. At this point, area-based reinforcements trigger, and a squad of apothecaries spawn from the bottom left and right. I move as quickly as I can to clear the rooms, leaving FE behind to block the reinforcements at the door as I push towards Ryoma. With this, I managed to get the Armor Slayer, which would be extremely important for the next map, but unfortunately, as I approach the escape point, large numbers of enemies move in, blocking me from getting the other treasure chest. I have to handle this delicately because there's a nearby lunge apothecary that can move you way out of position. So first, to handle this, I have Mozu snipe a threatening spendthrift apothecary, and then use parry as bait to lure out the lunge. Parry gets lunged over the wall, but fortunately, that small area is surrounded by pots and is surprisingly safe, despite the massive numbers of enemies nearby. I have parry swapped to Jacob, who is quite tanky. He is able to distract a couple of enemies, moving them out of the way. With this, I am able to secure an escape route for Korin to complete the map. But more importantly, I also secure a route to the treasure on the right. I make an effort to reach the other chest, which has 5,000 gold, but at the last moment, I mess up a couple of inputs and find myself unable to both break open the adjacent pots and open the chest. At this point, I was already a couple hours into playing this map and didn't want to reset, so I just gave up on the treasure and sent Korin to the escape point to leave. In chapter 13 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we get Benny, who has 0 strength, and Charlotte, who has 0 strength. While Benny is rather durable, his poor mobility and lack of offensive potential make him difficult to use, and Charlotte is probably only useful as a stat backpack. This is a route map with some timed objectives, villagers with loot that will be destroyed by an outlaw if you don't move quickly enough. To begin the map, I send Mozu to the left and most of the rest of my units to the right. With buff support, Mozu is able to one-round the enemy diviners, while Korin is able to do considerable damage to armor knights with the armor slayer I got in the previous chapter. A few turns in, 4 sets of Wyvern Rider armor knight pairs will move across the river to attack. I try to clean up the initial enemies as quickly as I can to prepare for their arrival. I collapse everyone into a tight-knit formation so the Wyverns can't find easy targets to pick off. Once the Wyverns launch their attack, they swap to the armor knight in the pairing to increase their damage, but this drastically reduces their mobility. Defeating the armor knights takes effort from quite a few units, but I can one-round the Wyverns with bows. Unfortunately, I can't handle the entire wave in one go, but since the active enemies are low move armors, I'm able to body block them to reduce their effectiveness. This allows me to divide and conquer and pick them apart over the course of several turns. At this point, the outlaw is rapidly approaching their villages, so I have to hurry to stop him. Since I took longer than normal to deal with the Wyverns and armors, I'm in no position to perform a normal interception. Orochi's main squad is still in the way, so I decide to make a risky play. I have Camilla fly past Orochi's group to ferry Korin across the river, directly occupying the village and obtaining 5,000 gold. The reason this is dangerous is that it puts Korin in direct range of Reina and 6 cavaliers. But fortunately, Korin's defense is high enough that most of the cavaliers actually ignore Korin entirely and rush to attack the rest of my units. I have Mozu engage Orochi's diviners at the bridge, using the narrow area as a choke point, and Mozu is even able to one-round Orochi because of a reverse weapon triangle advantage against Calamity Gate. On Korin's side, I managed to get ahead of the outlaw and slowly kill him over the course of several turns, but as I do this, Korin is repeatedly shot by Reina to the point where all my healing resources have been exhausted. To escape certain doom, I have Korin retreat to my main force, who at this point have cleaned up the enemies they were facing. Reina chases the exhausted Korin, only to be swarmed by my entire army, who attack her for marginal chip EXP before I allow Mozu to finish her off. I then swing around to take care of Takumi's squad, and the Hoshiden Royal Archer is no match for my peasant villager archer, who by the way has 0 strength. I claim the rest of the loot and then turn to the final group of enemies, which is led by Scarlet. Once you trigger her group, 2 batches of reinforcements spawn, a squad of Wyvern Riders in the upper left and a squad of Cavaliers in the lower right. I use the house to make a choke point to deal with Scarlet and have everyone else huddled in the upper left to ambush the Wyvern Riders. Once they spawn, I'm able to shoot them down immediately with Mozu and Niles. Korin, despite having 0 magic, is able to just completely overpower Scarlet's group, and as the reinforcements come in, they get stuck on the bridge, allowing me to farm them for experience and weapon XP. With this, all the enemies have been defeated, and we complete the map. In the closing cutscene, Takumi seethes because, despite having fought Korin 3 times, he has had 0 victories. In chapter 14 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we get Keaton, who has 0 strength, and Leo, who has 0 strength and magic. Keaton has 2x effective damage against beast units when using a beast stone, which is actually a lot less useful than you might imagine, and Leo is serviceable as a filler unit. This map starts off with an assault by enemy samurai and sky knights, who can be easily blocked off and defended against. After recruiting Keaton and cleaning up the initial wave, I use hit and run attacks to clear the top platform, after which I transfer everyone upwards using my flying units. The most notable and dangerous feature of this chapter are a squad of linked AI enemies on the right side of the map. Once you approach, they will attack, and 6 deadly fire reinforcements will spawn from the left. Attacking into the right side is risky because it's very easy to get swarmed and overwhelmed, so I make things easy for myself by using a human sacrifice. I send in a captured wyvern rider as bait to trigger the enemy aggression and reinforcements. I use Leo to block the ground enemies at a choke point and have everyone else prepare to intercept the fire reinforcements. As of the last map, I was able to upgrade the armory, allowing me to buy effective weapons such as the Hunter's Knife and Beast Killer, which combined with Keaton's Beastbane and my 2 archers adds up to quite a bit of damage against Sky Knights and Kishi Knights. But even with all these effective weapons, I'm only able to take out 4 out of the 6 flyers, leaving me vulnerable to a counterattack. I considered using a freeze staff to stop the last enemy pair, but since Elise has 0 magic, her staff hit rate is so abysmal that I don't even bother. I prepare to reset as the enemy Kishi Knight attacks Camilla with a bow, and I'm surprised to see that she just tanks the hit and survives. As it turns out, Camilla is just that good, and I had simply underestimated her durability. With this setup, I'm able to clean up the flyers and the remaining ground enemies. I carefully pick off the entrapped Shrine Maiden and archer guards near the boss, and then prepare to capture him. Kumagera is a notable unit because of his good bulk and many uncommon skills, which simultaneously makes him hard to capture. I deal chip damage with Mozu, and then use Kazi to debuff and poison strike him down to 1 HP. This allows Niles to just barely do some damage with maximum buff support. I forget to use the capture command and accidentally kill him, ending the map by completing the chapter. In chapter 15 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we get Gunter, who has 0 strength. Gunter has fast access to several damage skills, but is also very fragile because of his extremely low speed. This is a restricted deployment map where we can only use Korin, Azura, and Gunter. The goal of this map is to either escape in the top area within 20 turns, or to defeat the boss in the bottom area by using the nearby dragon veins to create clones. These copies are functionally identical to the original unit, and they even share HP, but unfortunately Azura's clone cannot refresh actions, making her completely useless on the other side. Merely escaping is relatively easy, but if you defeat the boss and enemies on the bottom side of the map, you can get additional stat boosters and items. In order to push the bottom lane more quickly, it is imperative that I maximize Korin's damage, as she is the only capable combat unit on this map. To this end, I immediately reclass Gunter into a Malignite, so his parrot bonus grants additional magic to boost Korin's Dragonstone damage. This, combined with Gunter's personal skill, a tonic, and a meal, makes Korin kind of okay. Korin is able to clear most of the common melee enemies, but struggles a lot against the ninjas because of their 1-2 range and high resistance. Even worse, some of the ninjas have Poison Strike, so they're difficult to completely ignore. I tried this map several times, and most of my attempts have unsatisfactory results because I am slowed down too much by the ninjas, so I change my tactics and go directly for the boss, but this causes me to lose out on some of the other loot. Once I reach the boss, Korin is able to easily win, granting me a speed wing that will probably do nothing but rot on the convoy until the final map. In chapter 16 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we get Felicia, who has 0 strength and 0 magic, and Xander, who has 0 strength. Felicia is okay, but is much less versatile when joining late compared to the version that joins in chapter 6, and Xander is a very tanky unit who will be very useful for survivability. On this map, we must investigate 4 neutral soldiers to find the boss, with a gold reward that reduces every turn. This encourages you to move faster to get more gold, but unfortunately, whether or not I can move quickly is not really my choice. I start the map by pushing through the left, using Mozu to 1-round mages. Xander is able to tank the physical enemies, allowing me to safely lure small enemy groups. By defeating the now promoted enemies for increased XP, I managed to promote Mozu into a sniper, increasing her strength by 0, and level up Jacob to grant him the life and death skill, increasing his damage by 10, which is absolutely massive. Gunter and Camilla also managed to get Savage Blow, which is incredibly useful for after combat percent HP damage. With Savage Blow, I can deal considerable chip damage to multiple enemies in tight formations, allowing me to wipe the left side of the map with relative ease. I then move on to the right side of the map, which is trickier to handle because of some particularly strong enemies, such as a very fast Shining Pool Adventurer. But after acquiring several powerful skills, I can kill even the toughest enemies of the map with a combination of Poison Strikes, Savage Blows, and attacks from Mozu. I reach the final soldier and talk to him, spotting the boss of the map, which is Shura. Shura starts with a 1-range mini bow equipped, making it trivial to take him down with anyone from 2 range, and shockingly, I have moved fast enough to actually get some of the gold rewards forward. We are then given the option on what to do with Shura, who has 0 strength. We can either kill him for a pair of boots or recruit him. Shura himself isn't a particularly impressive unit in this challenge. While he does have some good reclasses, his restricted support options greatly limits his ability to get a good skill set. On the other hand, the boots probably aren't that useful in this challenge either, so I choose to recruit Shura because the items he joins with are worth slightly more when sold. In chapter 17 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we will no longer obtain new characters for main story chapters, but we can still recruit child characters, and there are still many useful capturable enemies who will be critical to the success of the run. I decide to invest some money into silver weapons, namely a silver bow. Silver weapons are normally pretty bad in Fates because using them repeatedly incurs a stacking strength and skill penalty, but since my units have 0 strength, the downside is partially mitigated. While the penalty still cancels out existing bonuses, your displayed strength stat will never be reduced below 0. This is the infamous Ninja Hell map, which in accordance with this name is foe of ninjas. Of particular note is that some of the master ninjas on this map have both the Poison Strike and Grizzly Wound skills, which stack to allow them to deal 40% of the enemy's HP after combat. In a normal playthrough, where you can one-round enemies with ease, 40% max HP damage after combat is at best a third-rate damage option, but here it is absolutely top tier. Poison Strike plus Grizzly Wound is an incredible and hard to obtain combination under normal circumstances, but here we can capture up to 4 of these master ninjas on this map alone. As the map starts, we get the neutral green unit Saizo, who will move through the map independently. If you can keep him alive, you'll get a speed wing at the end of the map, but doing so normally requires you to move quickly to stay ahead of him, which naturally I cannot do. Fortunately, there is a trick to this. This map is full of dragon veins that manipulate the terrain, and if you use them properly, you can trap Saizo in a room to ensure that he is safe. I begin by moving upwards. I use Xander and Korin as walls to block the ninjas, their high defense making the enemy's attacks ineffective. Stopping Saizo from going forward and getting himself killed is unfortunately pretty difficult since he is an allied unit and can move through your characters. But if you block off every single tile that he can move to, you can effectively stop him. This buys me time to set up captures for several of the desired master ninjas with Niles, who makes excellent use of the silver bow to do more than 0 damage. I make preparations to trap Saizo in the upper room, but I accidentally trigger the reinforcements. After fighting them off, Saizo is lured by the remaining enemies, and I trap him inside by activating the Dragon Vein, securing another speed wing that I will not use until my units are level capped for fear of wasting stats. I now have free reign to rampage across the map, which I do so at a leisurely and relaxed pace. I move methodically throughout the map, walling at choke points and slowly clearing enemies in a way that is honestly quite similar to how I play the map in vanilla Conquest. After going through the map, only one challenge remains, which is the boss room. It contains movement reducing caltrops as well as several powerful linked AI enemies. I'm able to exploit this by using shelter strats to poke in and out without provoking them. Now only the boss Kotor remains, but his defense is surprisingly low, allowing me to one-shot him with a killer bow crit. This completes the map, and I have managed to capture 4 of the Poison Strike Grizzly Wound ninjas, and they will be a tremendous addition to my roster for upcoming chapters by drastically increasing the amount of damage I can do. In chapter 18 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we face an immense challenge, a map with a hard time limit. The objectives are to defeat a total of 3 bosses, Zola on the top of the map and 2 para-generals at the bottom, and we must do this all within 20 turns or else we will get a game over. Because of the time limit as well as the high number of tanky high defense enemies, this is one of the maps I've been most worried about in this challenge. My usual slow roll grinding strats will simply not work here. In preparation for this chapter, I go all out with my purchases. I buy a Levin sword with Jacob, who I reclassed into a swordmaster for the swordfair skill, giving him a total of plus 15 damage with swords. I also buy armor slaying weapons like the hammer and anti-beast weapons such as the beast killer and hunter's knife. I also buy a silver dagger, which can be used quite effectively by the 4 master ninjas I just recruited, because their 0 strength cannot be reduced below 0 by the dagger's debuffs. Furthermore, captured units will join with a maxed out weapon rank, which does grant a small amount of bonus damage. I start by testing out quite a few starting configurations. Normally, I will play this map by piling everyone onto one side to increase my force concentration, but when I try this, I just get bottlenecked and cannot make quick progress. So, horrifyingly, I am forced to play the map as it was originally intended, with my forces split across both sides to attack from multiple directions. The 2 sides of the map have different enemy compositions. The top side, where Zola is stationed, is stacked with sorcerers and heroes, and the bottom side is mainly populated by generals and a variety of horse units. I begin by pushing upwards because the heroes and sorcerers, despite doing a lot of damage, are much easier to kill due to their lower defenses. I deploy all 4 of the Master Ninjas I captured last chapter, and I allocate most of my forces to the right side of the map with a smaller force to the left. On the left side, I lead with Corrin and Xander to tank the heroes, while Jacob is somehow nearly able to one-round enemies with the Levin Sword. As it turns out, the high base might of magical weapons combined with plus 15 damage from skills goes a long way against low resistance physical enemies. On the right side, I send in my Master Ninjas, who join with high speed and resistance, allowing them to fight the enemy sorcerers. The ninjas apply devastating debuffs with a silver dagger, which I can pass between units to use multiple times per turn. Using this, I'm able to utterly destroy the sorcerers with stacked percent max HP damage from their skills, in combination with a surprising amount of damage from their daggers. Having annihilated the first group of enemies with surprising ease, I then move on to attack Zola. There are several challenges in doing this. The first is a lack of space in the boss room, which makes it difficult to get the surface area I need to attack with my entire army. And the second is a deadly wave of reinforcements that spawn from the stairs to turn after you engage. In one attempt, I tried to bait the enemies out, but those enemies combined with the reinforcements stack up to a group of 8, which is simply way too many for me to handle in one turn. Even with the power of my 40% max HP damage ninjas, I will still need 3 or so actions to defeat any single enemy. Normally, I would fall back to try to take advantage of terrain or split the enemy up into more manageable chunks, but I can't do that because of the map's time limit, so I'm forced to attack in and I can only take out around half of the enemies, leading to some important units dying on enemy phase, forcing a reset. On a later attempt, I try a more proactive approach. I open by attacking the hero pair with Camilla to launch him over the wall, allowing me to pile on him and kill him immediately. I can't get enough units in range to attack the sorcerer, so I block the entrance to the room to stop him from attacking anyone important. I also decided to try something. Something I did not know going into the map is that you can actually block these reinforcements by standing on the stairs, which causes 4 enemies to straight up not spawn, effectively neutralizing them. The reason I was confused is that it's not immediately obvious if a group of reinforcements can even be blocked. Sometimes, if you try to block reinforcements, they'll simply enter the map on the nearest empty space. I take out the remaining grunts and then fight Zola. I was worried that he could be slow to kill because he can self-heal with Nosferatu, but as it turns out, these concerns were unfounded. I attack with a Master Ninja to take away 40% of his max HP after combat, preventing any Nosferatu healing from taking effect, and then attack with Jacob. As it turns out, a combination of high speed and plus 80 avoid from the Duelist Blow and Tonebreaker skills on Jacob has stacked so much avoid that enemy mages literally cannot touch him. Jacob attacks, and Zola, who has 0 hit, stands no chance and is quickly slain. With this, I've cleared the top half of the map, but there are only 8 turns remaining. There is treasure on this side, but it's not really worth going for. There's an energy drop which I cannot use because stat boosters cannot increase my strength, and there's a Master Seal which is useless for me at this point in the game. So I move everyone to the bottom side of the map, which is full of cavaliers and generals, all of whom have high defense. But fortunately, I came prepared with effective weaponry. Sadly, the Hammer and Armor Slayer underperform because the enemy generals still have way too much defense. The anti-cavalry weapons do better, but even they pale in comparison to the sheer amount of damage that my Master Ninjas do, because their percent HP damage scales with the enemy's high HP. But even the Master Ninjas are outshined by an unexpected competitor. Jacob hits like a truck with a Levin Sword and plus 15 damage from skills, and unlike Poison Strike, his damage can actually kill enemies. I then decide to immediately go for the remaining bosses, which are a pair of incredibly tanky generals. Their stats are no joke. They have incredibly high defense, making it difficult to kill them quickly, and they also deal a lot of damage on the counterattack, making attacking with squishier or damaged units much more risky. And to add the cherry on top, they also have Wary Fighter, meaning that you cannot double them. At this point, there's only a few turns left, giving me barely enough time to heal my units. I set things up by enemy phasing the generals with a Master Ninja, applying his dagger debuff and activating Grizzly Wound, reducing the general's strength and chucking him for 20% of his HP. This aggroes all of the remaining enemies and causes generals and cavaliers to spawn from the stairs. I'm able to block the cavalry by placing Corrin at the bottom of the map, and the reinforcements fortunately spawn too far away to reach me this turn. With this, I have everyone in range to attack. With the strength debuff from my dagger and the enemy silver weapon, the enemy general has lost strength to the point where my Master Ninjas can easily attack without being one-shot, allowing me to hit him for 40% of his HP twice in a row. Now I have taken away all of the boss's health entirely with after combat effects, leaving him with only 2 HP, and then attack with Mozu to peel off the shield gauge, and deal the last tiny sliver of damage with an Armor Slayer from Xander. This handles the first general, but there is still the second general. I have to take him out immediately to not lose units on the counterattack. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, the bottom general has not been debuffed, meaning that I cannot attack safely with my remaining Master Ninjas as they would die on the counter. So I decided to go all in and move Corrin away for blocking the enemy reinforcements to attack the general with their Dragonstone. Corrin at this point does not have Draconic Hex yet, but is only a few XP points away from leveling up. A little known and typically completely useless trick is that if you level up after combat and gain a skill, that skill can apply after combat effects immediately even if you didn't have it when you initiated the attack. So by level 4 promoted Corrin attacks, gain enough XP from fighting the general to get to level 5, and obtain the Draconic Hex skill, allowing her to immediately apply the Draconic Hex debuff, dropping all of the general's stats by 4. This allows Kaze to attack without being one-shot, letting me pile on more % max HP damage. I continue attacking, even using pair-ups with Jacob, who was hit with a freeze stat, making him unable to participate in the fight. One last Master Ninja brings the general's HP down to 1, and I deal the last point of damage with a Flame Shuriken from Kaze. As the last boss falls, the map is completed in 19 turns, just barely under the limit. And honestly, I was quite surprised by this outcome because I beat a map that I thought I would be soft-locked on in only a handful of attempts. I thought the Master Ninjas would be good, but they exceeded my every expectation and will be critical for dealing with the increasingly strong enemies in upcoming chapters. In preparation for the next chapters in Conquest with Zero Strength and Magic, I decided to do some child paralogs to gain XP and build my support and weapon ranks. I have managed to get Corrin and Jacob to an S support rank, which I primarily use to transfer the Samurai class line to Jacob to give him the Swordfare and Life and Death skills, which he can obtain earlier than other characters. This pairing can also be used to transfer Jacob's high-level skills to his children, so again get them earlier than is normally possible. I move on to play Dwyer's Paralog, which is notable because it is extremely easy and quick to complete. All you need to do is to defeat the boss, which can be done as early as turn 1 without interacting with the rest of the map. I take a few more turns to do this to push my support and weapon ranks, and I soon defeat the boss to recruit Dwyer, to whom I have passed on Draconic Hex and Life and Death. Dwyer has 0 strength and magic and unfortunately starts as a Troubadour, so when he is promoted with the free Offspring seal, he will only have E weapon ranks, making him unable to use most weapons. So to patch this up, I decided to move on to my other available paralog, which is Kana's chapter. This map is excellent for training your units because of the high enemy count and the presence of higher level boss enemies that can grant you more XP. On this map, we get a green unit Kana who unfortunately has 0 strength and magic, which makes an otherwise solid ally unit more or less completely worthless. On this map, small groups of enemies become aggressive every turn, and the best way to handle this is to wipe out each group the turn they start attacking. If you don't do this, it is easy to be overwhelmed as the enemies start stacking up. I begin the map by wiping out the first 2 waves of flying ninjas with my archers, who can easily one-round them even with 0 strength. My master ninjas play a big role in dealing considerable damage to the next wave of samurai, because 40% on max HP is 40% on max HP. The next few waves fall in short order, but their later groups of enemies are a bit tougher because there's more variety in the enemy types. Fortunately, I'm able to use the Dragon Veins to manipulate the terrain and split up the enemies to defeat them in detail. I soon complete the map and recruit Kana, who has 0 strength and magic. Unfortunately, I majorly fucked up with his build, so he is a complete disaster and is utterly useless. In chapter 19 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we have to handle a route map against 37 Kitsune, all of whom do 2x effective damage against beast units. Currently, the only vulnerable unit I am using is Xander, who I decide to reclass into a Wyvern Lord. This removes his weakness for this map, but more importantly, it also gives him flying utility, which will be very important for the next 2 chapters as well. By this point, I have also managed to get Kaze and Camilla to an S support rank. The goal of this pairing is to stack Poison Strike and Savage Blow to deal massive % HP damage, and then double up on that with the Replicate seal from the Mechanist class line to increase my unit count and action economy. This skill combination can then be passed down to Midoriya, giving me a total of 6 Poison Strike Savage Blow units, which should be able to wreak absolute havoc on my enemies. To this end, I reclass Camilla into a Mechanist to build towards Poison Strike and Replicate, but I will have to wait to reclass Kaze because of a limit on partner seals until I get the level 3 staff store. My usual strategy for chapter 19 will be to completely cheese this map by deploying many flying units and hitting the enemies for complete safety on the mountains. Unfortunately, most of the characters I want to train are not flying units, and so doing it that way would leave me slightly less prepared for future chapters. So instead, I decided to fight the Kitsune head on, which is much more difficult and only marginally more rewarding, but I'm not playing this challenge to have an easy time. The map starts with 8 initially aggressive enemies, with around half coming from the top and the other half coming from the left. My initial attempts go poorly because I simply cannot fight 8 enemies at once. And sadly, Dwyer, the child unit that I created and trained specifically for an advantage on this map, underperforms because his speed is too low to double and his damage is a lot less impressive than I thought it would be, even with a hunter's knife. So I decided to try something else. I have Xander act as bait. Typically, unless there are specific conditions programmed in, enemies in Fire Emblem Fates will move to attack the closest enemy that they can damage. So I decided to exploit this by having Xander fly to the mountains above the starting area to repeatedly bait and stall the enemies at the top. This high defenses and a lack of beast weakness due to his reclass, he is able to keep half of the initially aggressive enemies occupied indefinitely, splitting the 8 strong enemy group into 2 groups of 4. And this lets me completely wipe out the first group of 4 with my stacked percent HP damage. Once I allow the other half to come down, they suffer a similar fate. The remaining enemies on this map are split into similarly sized linked AI groups that move together, including 2 groups of 7 and 1 group of 10. All of these are too large for me to handle all at once, but using similar tactics, I'm able to split them up into more manageable chunks. By doing this, even the map's gimmick of some Kitsune periodically becoming untargetable is no big deal because I fight them in small enough numbers that it doesn't matter. The boss Kaden is slightly stronger than the other Kitsune, but it doesn't matter because I am confident in being able to kill nearly any enemy that can at most only have 100% of their own max HP. In chapter 20 of Conquest with Zero Strength and Magic, we are up against Fuga and the Wind Tribe in a map popularly known as Fuga's Wild Ride. For this chapter, I have managed to get a Korin Mozu A support, allowing me to reclass Korin into a Kinshi Knight, giving her flying mobility and bow access, but more importantly, access to the Quick Draw skill for additional damage. This map's gimmick consists of winds that will periodically move your units around, making it difficult to position correctly. If you're not careful, it's easy for your units to be blown upwards into extremely lethal and strange situations. For example, in one of my attempts, Niles was straight up transported to fucking Narnia as he moved over 20 tiles from the bottom to the top of the map. I begin the map by moving everyone over to the left. The first batch of enemies are a group of Onmyoji that are easily handled by my ninjas, and quite a few of the aggressive enemies mainly consist of flyers. High bow might and 3x effective damage generally means that flyers can be taken out much more easily than most other units. The winds blow my units around and I struggle to keep everyone organized, but fortunately there are a lot of usable choke points, and most of the enemy groups are relatively small. Once the enemies on the bottom of the map are cleared, I shift over to the upper left where I'm able to completely wipe out an enemy squad with overpowering bow damage. For the remaining enemies, I make extensive use of the dragon veins that blow enemy units around to split them up and take them out in small groups. Once all the reinforcements are handled, Fuga is no big deal, and I see to complete the map. All in all, this wasn't too much different from a normal clear, probably because the biggest threat on the map, the flying units, can be defeated in only one round, just like a normal playthrough. In chapter 21 of Conquest with Zero Strength and Magic, we need to climb the Eternal Stairwell, which might be one of the most skippable maps in the game because it sucks and I hate it. I briefly considered the practicality of playing this map normally to gain experience, but I quickly dismissed the thought once I realized that basically nobody in my army can do any damage, which is bad when there are infinite Void Curse reinforcements every turn. There isn't any worthwhile loot, and if I really need XP, it'll be much easier to get it on a later map. So to save myself a lot of trouble, I decided to perform a fairly standard Xander skip. I deploy only Korin and Xander, and move on turn 1 to activate the Freeze Dragon Vein to avoid attacks. With defense buffs, Xander doesn't take much damage per hit, but on turn 3 he will have to tank 7 hits, which cuts things pretty close. Fortunately, with some shield gauge activations and defense buffs from meals and tonics, he's able to survive, allowing him to escape immediately on turn 4 to clear the map. All in all, I spent only around 10 minutes on this chapter, which is extremely fast considering that nearly every other chapter in this challenge tends to take at least 2 to 3 hours to complete. In chapter 22 of Conquest with Zero Strength and Magic, we are up against Sakura's map, which splits her army into 2 groups. On the left side, where Korin is force deployed, you fight Hana, and on the other, you fight Tsubaki. While this split army concept is the core design of this map, it is easily circumvented by pairing everyone up to put everyone in your army on one side. In all of the times I've played this chapter, I don't think I've ever once interacted with the right side of the map. The clear of this chapter is also quite similar to that of a normal playthrough. The enemy blacksmiths and only chieftains are easily handled at a 1-tile choke point, and are a great source of XP. One notable problem is Hana, who starts in a very cramped space with linked AI, making her difficult to attack. Her offensive stats are very high, and with bonus damage from her Rend Heaven skill, she can easily one-round meta units if you're unlucky. Hilariously though, in this challenge, Rend Heaven is a lot weaker for enemies because it is based on the opponent's strength or magic, which in my case is 0, meaning that even if it activates, it will pretty much do nothing. But all of this doesn't actually matter because you can just use a sacrificial unit to lure Hana into attacking, attacking and becoming aggressive. Then by backing up to the starting area, you can get enough surface area to kill her and her small retinue by attacking her with your entire army. After extracting enough XP from the map, I managed to get Camilla to level 15, granting her the replicate skill from the Mechanist class line. This allows her to create a copy of herself that shares all of her stats, skills, and inventory. But more importantly, it basically gives you another free unit, which is great for obvious reasons. In Camilla's case, this actually allows her to get bonus damage from her own personal skill by being adjacent to herself. I use this to attack and kill Yukimura, and then quickly cease to avoid having to deal with the reinforcements. Chapter 23 of Conquest with Zero Strength and Magic will be a big difficulty spike, so I decided to do some paralogs first. First up will be Percy's paralog, who is Arthur and Mozu's son. I passed down Aptitude and HP plus 5, but I'm not really expecting much from him as a unit. Instead, I mainly aim to play his paralog for its rewards. The concept of this chapter is that you can use the Dragon Vein scattered across a map to intimidate enemies for 500 gold per unit. This causes those enemies to retreat so you don't have to fight them. This map is often done more for the gold than the XP, and it's generally much easier to do earlier than later, because many of the enemies have effective weaponry and have a very quick aggression timer. If you don't move quickly, the entire map of 46 units will attack you, which in my case is not survivable. My efforts on this map are highly based on trial and error because this is the first time I've ever tried playing this paralog. Most of my initial attempts just end with me being completely bodied by the aggression timer, or the entire map gangs up to kill me. But eventually I work out a plan that has some degree of success. The Dragon Veins will intimidate all units in a 3-tile radius, but the enemies do not often move in a convenient way, so I decided to take advantage of one of the only mechanics in the game that lets you move enemies, the lunge skill. Camilla and her replicate can use lunge, and so can Kaze because I briefly reclassed him into Malignite to get Savage Blow, before reclassing him to Mechanist to go for a replicate. But this isn't enough to move all the enemies I need to, so I also equip lunge on Xander and Gunter, and I even end up dragging an underleveled Baruka off the bench, as well as a random lunge priestess that I captured in chapter 20, giving me a total of 7 lunge units. As I open the map, I send Xander and 4 lunge units to the left and both Camillas to the right. With this, I'm able to lunge all the initial enemies into Dragon Vein range, intimidating 6 units on the left and 6 more on the right for a total of 6,000 bonus gold. I then move everyone into the upper right to bait enemies into yet another Dragon Vein. I defeat the first group of Wyvern Lords so I can snag a bigger group, and then manage to Dragon Vein 7 enemies for 3,500 gold, killing the rest to stay safe. I then move to the center and block a couple of enemies in the hopes of catching the rest of the map all in one go. But the enemies are too spread out for this to work, so I only end up Dragon Veining around half of them and then retreat with the rest of my units. Xander gets lunged around and is attacked repeatedly, but barely manages to survive because of a lucky shield gauge activation against the Wormslayer. I pop another Dragon Vein to catch some stragglers and then just decide to kill the remaining enemies for experience. Now, the only unit left on the map is Percy, who is normally aggressive, but funnily enough, this behavior has changed because he has 0 strength. Since he can't do any damage to any of my units, he will not try to move towards or attack anyone, breaking his AI and making him stationary. I go up and defeat him to complete the map, from which I have obtained a total of 14,500 gold, which is quite a lot. In the Midori paralog of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we recruit Midori, who has 0 strength. Midori is Kaze and Camilla's child, and my intention is for all 3 of them to have the exact same build. Each unit will have Poison Strike and Savage Blow for massive amounts of post-combat % max HP damage, and Replicate to create even more of the same unit. The other 2 skills will either be damage skills or lunge. The combat potential of these units will surpass even that of the chapter 17 Master Ninjas that have carried the run for the past few chapters. I passed down Trample and Savage Blow so Midori doesn't have to reclass to get those skills, then immediately promote her into Mechanist with the Offspring seal, which automatically grants her Poison Strike. The goal of this map is to defeat the adventurer Candace, who has a unique model but is otherwise unremarkable. Merely defeating her will be quite simple, so my goal instead is to farm the entire map so that Kaze and Midori can reach level 15 and get the Replicate skill. It will be easier to level up if I waited to fight higher level enemies by advancing the main story, but getting past chapter 23 is in itself very difficult, and I need to maximize my army's power in order to have a chance on that map. Candace will try to escape the map through a predetermined route, so I start by immediately ferrying everyone over the trees to get ahead of her to cut her off. I set an ambush, and with a massive number of savage blows from Camilla, Kaze, Midori, Percy, and Camilla again, I managed to absolutely clear the group, as well as body blocking Candace to stop her from moving forward. With the boss trapped, I am free to go through an elaborate process process of extracting all the XP I can out of the remaining enemies. XP gain in Conquest is heavily thresholded by enemy level, and you will find it very difficult to level up once you're higher level than your opponent. At this point in the story, the paralog scaling is such that common enemies are promoted level 12 and elite enemies are promoted level 16. If you feed the kills of the level 16 enemies to specific units, it's just barely possible to get them to level 15. I managed to power level Kazi to level 15 to get Replicate, but majority only manages to hit level 14 before the map ends, which leaves me feeling slightly underprepared for what is probably the second hardest map in this challenge. Chapter 23 of Conquest with Zero Strength and Magic is a particularly notable chapter for its high difficulty and for the presence of valuable capturable units such as Rallyman, a master of arms that has 4 rally skills. The main challenge of this map is scaling the Great Wall of Susanoo, which has 4 sets of front-facing stairs that provide easy access for attacking armies. This brilliant architectural design decision is an example of Conquest's gameplay story integration by providing insight into Hoshido's military capabilities, directly showing through in-game interactions why Hoshido is losing this war. However, in Lunatic difficulty, the dastardly Hoshidans had developed the devious tactic of blocking 2 of the 4 stairs, which funnels the entry points into a cramped kill zone. Throughout several unsuccessful attempts, I thoroughly established that trying to take the wall through the left 2 stairwells will almost certainly result in significant casualties. Because my army's damage output per unit is pretty low, it is imperative that I have enough surface area to launch my attacks, but the space on the wall is constrained even for a normal playthrough. The sheer strength of the enemy garrison on the wall makes it nearly impossible to survive going through the left stairs, so I'm forced to figure out a different method, and the solution I come to is honestly not very good, but it's not like I have many other options. I start the map by attacking and capturing Rallyman, which causes some units to attack in small waves. These enemies can be handled by using the wide open area to hit them with my entire army. The next step is my plan to scale the wall, which uses the Entrap Staff. Entrap is a higher rank staff that can be used to kidnap a single faraway enemy to the staff user. My plan is to use this to move one of the units blocking the stairways on the right, which will allow me to have a safer entry point onto the wall. Unfortunately, the Entrap Staff has a very low hit rate, which is worsened by the fact that all my units have 0 magic. I give the Entrap Staff to a captured Falconite from chapter 20, since none of my other staff users have enough staff rank to use it, and fortunately, it just works on my first serious attempt. I decided to clear the other enemies outside the wall, which takes a lot more effort than I initially thought. But with some clever play, I'm able to use the terrains to outmaneuver the counter snipers and lunge spearmasters, defeating them in small groups by spamming Savage Blow. And I decide to leave Hinata's squad alone because they're very dangerous. Fortunately, they have area-based linked AI and can be bypassed entirely by flying around them. Once the outside is mostly clear, I sneak as many units as I can to the right side of the wall, which has some safe tiles. I lead with a high defense generic general that I capture in Midori's paralog, who is not that good because he doesn't have Worry Fighter and takes a ton of damage for being doubled. This causes the entire garrison to get moving, and unfortunately a sniper blocks the stairs I use to enter, cutting off my advanced squad's escape route. The wall is staffed by 3 main groups of enemies: counter snipers, lunge spearmasters, and an extremely lethal mixed group of units led by Oboro. I attack with most of my units, taking out most of the archers by using replicated Savage Blows to deal massive damage to their condensed formation, but the limit of my offensive capabilities are clear. I could only take out 1/3 of the enemies, and the remaining garrison comes crashing in. When I attacked, I made sure to position all my captured units in front as human shields, and they take the brunt of the assault. Oboro kills a generic Falcon Knight, and I also lose 3 out of 4 generic Master Ninjas in the attack, which is a very painful outcome but one that is still acceptable. Their sacrifice allows the remnants of my army to retreat after dealing a significant blow to the wall, leaving an exploitable gap in their defenses. The wall is mainly dangerous because there's no safe way to move onto it, but with 1/3 of the enemies gone, I'm given a ton of space to launch hit and run attacks to fight a war of attrition. None of the enemies on the wall have any healing capability, so any damage I deal will be permanent. And with that in mind, I decided to use an extremely safe and extremely degenerate method to grind them into submission. There is a ballista at ground level, which can shoot onto the wall, but normally all the enemies on the wall are out of range of that ballista. But if you can somehow bait them into range, you can shoot them for free damage. So I move a single unit onto the wall to convince the enemies to break formation and give chase before retreating back down the stairs. This lets me shoot them with the ground level ballista, ballista with impunity, dealing chip damage until they are all left with 1 HP, making them easy to pick off individually. After reducing the wall garrison's forces to a manageable number, I jump them with my entire army, completely wiping them out in 1 turn. This leaves the path to Takumi and the Seize Point wide open. After luring and killing the other 3 enemies in the room, I have Korin fight Takumi. Korin does a ton of damage, but then eats a vengeance for Takumi, which is a little scary. But after an Azura Sing and a Niles heal, I launch a second attack to take him out. Now the Seize Point is free for the taking, but that does not mean that the map is over. Hinata's squad, which I had previously left alone, actually has several useful capturable units. In particular, there is a sniper with a life and death skill, as well as Spearmasters that have rallies, and a Matarasu which provides AoE healing. Hinata's squad is quite tough and the formation is quite formidable, but by defeating Takumi first, you get some more options. You can use the ballista on Takumi's boss platform to repeatedly rain ballista shots down onto Hinata's group, dealing free chip damage that's unfortunately mitigated by the Amaterasu Spearmasters. I try attacking with the ballista for a while, but the hit rates are not too good, making it too inconsistent to overcome the passive healing. Soon though, I realized I can exploit the linked area AI with shelter strats to augment my chip damage. By attacking with a unit, dancing for that unit to escape, and then sheltering to protect Azura, you can launch attacks without triggering AI aggression, which lets you get hits in for free. By combining shelter strat savage blows with the ballista, I managed to drop the enemies of 1 HP, allowing me to capture all 3 of the Matarasu Spearmasters as well as a life and death sniper, adding several excellent generic units to our team. I then seized to complete the map. This chapter was really rough, and I think definitely surpassed chapter 18 in difficulty. The death of 3 Master Ninjas was not ideal, but I feel like I was still quite lucky to only lose 3 useful units on this map. To complete my builds for the final stretch of the game, I decided to do a paralog chapter, but unfortunately have none remaining. The last possible S-rank pairing I can make at this point is the Azura Niles pairing, which I have been building towards half-heartedly for quite a while, but never really took the effort to finalize. I find myself lacking just a few support points to get to S-rank, so I decided to play Invasion 2. Despite my units technically being over-leveled for this map, it is unexpectedly a hellish nightmare to play, especially since there are simply too many aggressive enemies on this map. I am forced to completely reorganize the My Castle to take full advantage of terrain by changing the style to Nestrian, which has canals that can limit enemy movement. To further impede the main group of enemies that come from the center, I also placed several invincible buildings up front and center to funnel most of the enemies into caltrops, which causes damage to units that stand on it. I also changed my building placement to put most of my unit spawns directly nearby the enemies to the left and the right, allowing me to kill them immediately when they spawn. Even with all these advantages, the map situation is still quite precarious. There are just so many enemies in the central group, and one enemy even has an entrap staff. Fortunately, my terrain setup, which took quite a bit of experimentation, worked quite well to slow and split up the central enemy group, damaging many of them and causing them to move in a slow trickle. This lets me dance around a trap range until I deal with it by using a generic general as bait. And at this point, the enemy forces are so depleted that he even managed to survive. For my efforts, I am rewarded with basically 0 experience and a Master Seal, which can only be sold for 500 gold. But with this, I finally managed to secure the Azura Niles S-rank pairing, granting me access to 2 paralog chapters. I then decided to do the Shigure paralog and conquers with 0 strength and magic. Here we get Shigure, who has 0 strength and 0 magic. He's Azura and Niles' son, and frankly I only made that pairing so I could play his map for the XP. On this map, our units start on a central boat that is repeatedly bordered by 2 enemy ships, with the top boat mainly containing berserkers and the bottom boat mainly containing sorcerers. Every other turn, one of the boats will dock and the other will move away, causing a trickle of enemies to move on both sides. Berserkers are quite easy to kill because of their low defense and resistance, while the sorcerers will be a little trickier, but their relatively low defense makes them easy fodder for my damage stacked physical units. Throughout the map, I make sure to finish Korin's build by reclassing briefly into Malignite for strength +2, and I complete her build by classing her back into Swordmaster for Swordfare. This combined with Quick Draw and Life and Death for her final build gives her an impressive +21 damage stack. I also push to make sure Mozu gets Life and Death by reclassing to Master of Arms, completing her build with +19 damage, after which I reclass her back into Sniper for the better speed cap. I also soon realized that the generic sniper that I captured in the previous chapter, now given the name Yamato, actually has potential that rivals Mozu. The sniper naturally has Life and Death, which when paired with Quick Draw and Bowfare for the sniper class line, he also gets a total of +19 damage, just like Mozu. He's only slightly worse than Mozu because of a lack of support bonuses, but getting another competent bow user right before one of the most fire-heavy maps in the game is a big advantage. I finished the map by routing all of the enemies and recruit Shigure, who will actually also be pretty useful the next next map even with 0 relevant skills and 0 strength. In chapter 24 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we face Hinoka and her legions of flyers. On this map, Hinoka will periodically activate Dragon Veins, which will drastically boost the movement of flying units, while simultaneously decreasing the movement of ground units. It can be quite difficult to deal with the massively expanded threat range of her flyers, which comprise more than half the enemies you will fight on this map. But you can counter this by activating Dragon Veins of your own, which will reverse this dynamic. By carefully sequencing your actions, you can exploit this mechanic to have boosted movement for all of your characters. Simply move your flyers first before activating the Dragon Vein, and that way both your flying and non-flying units will have boosted move for the turn. To bring in the strongest force I can for this map, I need to have as many flying units and bow users as possible. Archers are good for obvious reasons, and flyers are necessary to fight the enemy flyers over otherwise inaccessible terrain. I make sure to bring Shigure, who I promoted into a Kinshi Knight, to use effective damage with the Beast Killer as well as bows. The map starts with several sets of initially aggressive enemy squads. If I sit still, all of the enemies will crash into me at once, which is basically impossible to survive, so I decide to be proactive. I move out to attack, and I'm almost immediately overwhelmed and slaughtered pretty much instantly by the sheer number of enemies that are aggroed on top of additional group-based reinforcements. It takes a few tries before I realize that many of the close-by ground enemies are actually not aggressive until you move into their range. So by moving carefully, I can avoid fighting quite a few enemies and all their associated reinforcements until I'm more ready to do so. The initial wave of enemies comes in 3 groups. There's one squad of flyers from the bottom, a squad of ground units from the upper left, and even more flyers in the upper right. So I start the map by trying to defeat the enemies before they can join up. I start by setting all my flyers into the lower left, taking extreme care not to trigger the ground enemies on the island, because doing so will cause a massive amount of reinforcements to spawn. I easily manage to take out all 3 of these flyers with a massive amount of savage blows, using lunge to increase the flexibility of my attacking positions, allowing me to just barely stay out of range of the ground enemies. I then quickly move everyone back to the starting area to take out the flyers from the upper right, which is quite easy because of my high bow unit count. The last 4 enemies are aided and annihilated with even more savage blows. After dealing with the initial wave, I can now tackle each piece of the map in sequence. This map is structured such that there are 3 main groups of linked AI enemies that each have massive reinforcement waves attached to them. The first group are the enemies on the 2 close-by islands, the second is Setsuna squad, and the third are all the enemies that defend Hinoka. After initiating combat with any of these groups, you'll be hit with around a dozen reinforcements over the course of the next 2-3 turns, most of which are flyers. Fortunately, I am abnormally well equipped to fight flying units because of my high bow unit count, and I'm often able to one-round them, which is extremely good action economy in this challenge. I start by initiating combat against the enemies on the island to the left. I use Jacob as a wedge to block all of the Onmyoji, taking advantage of his Tonebreaker skill to dodge tank them, and have Korin block the Oni savages. While I do this, I set all the rest of my flying units to ambush the enemy reinforcements immediately when they spawn. I manage to clean up the island and the nearby flyers, but I am soon hit by a pincer attack by the remaining forces. 3 Falcon Knights attack from the left, and 3 more Falcon Knights plus 3 Onmyoji attack from the right. This is normally a formidable force, but unfortunately for the enemy, I can defeat flying units very easily. I one-round all of the enemies on the left with bows, and the enemies on the right have foolishly moved in 2 Dense formation, allowing me to do a ridiculous amount of damage with stacks of replicated savage blows. Next up is Setsuna's group, which frustratingly is in range of Azama's Hexing Rod. Azama has 6 Hexing Rod uses that can permanently have your unit's HP for the duration of the map, which is quite painful. I bait out the Hexing Rod with my squishy units and generics, then move on to take on Setsuna's squad, which once triggered will also launch 3 turns of reinforcements. I am pleased to once again find that the enemies have moved into an extremely dense formation that is very vulnerable to savage blow. While I managed to deal quite a savage blow against the enemy forces and take out Setsuna, there's still quite a few enemies remaining. I move Kaze to block off the Onmyoji reinforcements, but sadly, one of my Amaterasu Spearmasters dies on the counterattack. I take care of the Rebens on the next turn, and the 8 reinforcing flying units arrive too late to help, and they are felled by my archers. Now, only Hinoka and her defenders remain. Fortunately, this is the weakest of the 3 main enemy groups. I accidentally expose my flying units to enemy Kinshi Knights as I move to kill the reinforcing Oni chieftains, but I manage to salvage the situation by surrounding the cherry trees, making the enemies unable to fly over to launch an effective attack. All the remaining reinforcements are exclusively comprised of flying units, and I quickly obliterate them with a hail of arrows. After all of this effort, Hinoka goes down pretty quickly after being hit with 3 Poison Strike Savage Blows for 120% of her max HP, and she is finished off by Mozu. I try to capture her Oni chieftain pair-up because he has certain blow on life and death, but sadly Korin instantly evaporates him with a 57 damage crit. With this, I have routed the map and then seized to complete the chapter. This was a pretty tough map, and I definitely thought it would be even more ridiculous than it was, but fortunately Additionally, the high amount of enemy flyers made it much easier to handle large enemy groups, making it surprisingly manageable. Sadly, this is the last map where we fight flyers in any significant quantity, so this temporary advantage ends right here. In Chapter 25 of Conquest with Zero Strength and Magic, Ryoma challenges Korin to a duel, which will take a very long time because the damage output on both sides is minimal. Korin doesn't do much damage because she has zero strength and magic, and Ryoma won't be doing much damage either because Korin's defense is very high. On top of all of this, there is an aura effect in the room which reduces all damage taken to 1/4 of the original value. With all these factors in play, it's barely enough to overcome the 2 HP heal per turn that both characters are granted. Thus, nearly all lasting damage from either side will mainly be inflicted through skills or critical hits. And funnily enough, Ryoma's Rend Heaven skill will be ineffective because the bonus damage is based on Korin's strength. All that said, my focus on this chapter will not be on the duel, but rather on the rest of the map. Winning by defeating Ryoma will be relatively simple, but I have another objective in mind because the final few maps will be extremely difficult. In Chapter 23, I lost several important Master Ninjas, and this map is a perfect opportunity to replenish my ranks. The sides of this map are full of Master Ninjas with Inevitable End, which is an enemy-only skill that allows debuffs to stack infinitely. These enemies are arrayed in multiple stationary setups that are extremely difficult to survive, because nearly all of them have Poison Strike, Savage Blow, or Grisly Wound. Normally, you would only fight these enemies if Korin isn't strong enough to win the duel with Ryoma, but in my case, engaging them will actually work out in my favor. And this is because these Master Ninjas are excellent candidates for capture. They are level 15, so they can be trained to get the Replicate skill relatively quickly, and some even have Savage Blow. So when fully built, they can have a nearly identical build as the ones I have for Kaze, Camilla, and Midori. Since fighting the enemies on this map fairly is extremely difficult, I decided to use an easier method, which is through a unit sacrifice. I bring a whole bunch of useless generic units that I captured in previous chapters and use them as bait. I sacrifice a Sky Knight from Chapter 10 to bait out 3 Savage Flow Master Ninjas to the left, and I managed to successfully capture all of them, securing 3 incredibly useful units. The next section on the left is extremely lethal because the formation will not move until you can be attacked by 3 ranged lunge enemies, which will throw units across a wall where they will be surrounded and immediately killed by half a dozen enemies. The only real reward for this part of the map is a Silent Staff, which I can't use effectively because my staff users have zero magic. So I then move to the right to fight more enemies and capture more Master Ninjas. The enemies on the lower right are relatively easy to handle, but the next section on the right is an extremely deadly narrow hallway. Most of the enemies are stationary and will not budge until you move into the overlapping attack ranges, which will combine an overwhelming amount of percent max HP damage. Even in a normal playthrough, it is very difficult to survive this area, and none of my units are up to the task. So I decided to break up the enemy formation by sending in sacrificial units. I sent in a generic General Sniper pair up and they both die, baiting out some of the units, and then I sent in a generic Army Orgy to bait out even more. This is enough to clear all the enemies from the hallway, allowing me to launch hit and run attacks that are much more survivable. After a slow process of whittling down the enemies, I managed to capture 3 more Grisly Wound Master Ninjas and break through the formation to defeat Kagero. If I wanted the rest of my units to assist Korin in the duel, I will need to clear the left side and defeat Saizo. At this point, I have run out of units I'm willing to sacrifice on this map, so I then turn my focus to have Korin defeat Ryoma alone. At this point, we are well past the 20 turn limit, and Ryoma has become aggressive, attacking Korin repeatedly from 2 range. Unfortunately, the damage from Ryoma's critical hits and Astra activations adds up and Korin takes a lot of damage. It is very difficult to assist Korin from outside the chamber, but I managed to use a loophole to sneak Korin some extra healing by parking one of my Amaterasu Spearmasters just outside the paper screen. This heals Korin for 20% of her max HP every turn, which is more than enough to survive attacks indefinitely. That said, Korin can barely do any damage as she's not fast enough to double and her Levin Sword can't crit or activate skills, so my only option is to attack from one range with the Grim Yato, but the damage there is also not enough to overcome Ryoma's passive healing. But I managed to use a trick to use rally skills over the wall to boost Korin's stats. I buffed Korin's strength, speed, and skill with one of the Amaterasu Spearmasters and attacked Ryoma, allowing her to double and occasionally land critical hits and activate skills. But unfortunately, she is unable to enemy phase because Ryoma will just attack from 2 range with the Regento. By repeatedly attacking multiple times, Korin is eventually able to land enough Astras and critical hits to whittle down Ryoma's HP, and after quite a while, I finally managed to get him low enough to defeat him. And to land the final blow, I decided to have Mozu shoot him from outside the room. After Ryoma commits suicide to preserve Korin's moral purity, I go to the prison to recruit 6 newly captured Master Ninjas. If I train all of them to get Replicate and add them to Kaze, Camilla, and Midori, I will be able to have as many as 18 Poison Strikers, 12 with Savage Blow, and 6 with Grisly Wound, which will allow for a truly ridiculous amount of percent max HP damage. I then take one last detour to do the Nina paralogue. Nina is Azura and Nao's daughter, and her build is irrelevant because I'm doing her chapter just to train my newly captured characters. I would have liked to bring all 6 of the Master Ninjas that I just captured, but sadly the deployment limit is too low to bring that many untrained units while still being able to beat the map. As such, I decided to focus on the 3 ninjas that had Savage Blow, so I spent a bunch of gold reclassing all of them into Mechanist. On this map, you must rout all of the enemies before Nina can escape. Doing this normally in this challenge would be impossible, but luckily there is a common method of skipping this obstacle by using the Entrap Staff to immediately teleport Nina to defeat her on turn 1. Because my Entrap Staff hit rate is quite low, I end up resetting a bunch of times until it finally lands. Once Nina has been defeated, the majority of enemies on the map try to escape by leaving through the sides. So to maximize my XP gain, I move to the lower left to fight as many enemies as I can before they run. The remaining enemies are all held in the central room, which is initially enclosed. I pick off as many 2-range enemies as I can, and then open the door in the lower right to funnel the remainder through a 1-tile choke point, allowing me to slowly grind through all of the enemies to train my reclass Master Ninjas until they get Replicate, granting me a total of 6 Savage Blow Poison Strike Replicate units to leverage in the next map. In Chapter 26 of Conquest with Zero Strength and Magic, we are pitted against an incredibly difficult map, which is very challenging even under normal circumstances. The map is filled to the brim with extremely deadly foes as well as many enemies with Staff Savant, which gives their staffs infinite uses. And the boss Iago sits in the center where his staff range covers most of the map. He cycles through 4 different status staffs each turn, so you have to carefully time your movement so you aren't frozen or hexing rotted at an inopportune time. The map is organized into several rooms, each of which has a particular theme, and the first one we are up against mainly consists of heroes, many of whom are armed with Wyrm Slayers, which, notably, is always effective against Korra no matter what class she is in. I fail many attempts just on this first room because it's really quite tough to deal with, especially since most of the room lies within overlapping ranges of enemy status staffs. In addition to Iago, there is a Hexing Rod mage inside the room as well as an Entrap mage to the right. The Hexing Rod makes it inadvisable to stall, and it's very difficult to clear the heroes quickly without putting someone inside Entrap range, which will result in one unit being isolated and focused down. After many iterations, I finally work out a starting strategy. I start the map by having all of my Replicate Savage Blow characters create the replicates, adding many more units to my army. I immediately open the door and rush in to kill the Hexing Rod mage with Mozu, and then use a Sing Shelter strat to move her back. I use Xander and a generic general with Wary Fighter that I capture in Nina's paralogue to tank the enemy heroes as they move in. Their defense makes it possible to survive the onslaught, and this causes all of the heroes to bunch up into a very nice and tight formation, which notably is very vulnerable to Savage Blow, which is quite nice because at this point I can literally use Savage Blow a dozen times per turn. So I attack with a dozen Savage Blows and wipe all of them out. As I finish clearing the heroes, I put as many units as I can on the right side of the room so I can immediately rescue any unit that gets entrapped, and I manage to save the unit by using Lunge to pull threatening enemies closer so the bulk of my forces can attack more effectively. At this point, the situation calms down and we now have a decision. We can either go to the left and immediately die, or we can go to the right. The left room is full of Faceless and Stoneborn who are nearly impossible for me to fight in this challenge because of their ridiculous defenses and Wary Fighter, not to mention their tremendous damage at 1 to 5 range. Even in normal playthroughs, I would never try to clear this room. That's how scary it is. And with 0 strength and 0 magic, there's no way I will stand a chance in a straight-on fight. So instead, I go to the right room, which is full of sorcerers, which is also quite problematic, but it's not impossible. The enemies inside the room will not move until you open the door, so I take some time to organize everyone outside. But as I do this, I'm forced to eat a couple of freezes and enfeeble staffs along the way, weakening several members of my army. I have a much higher unit count than is normally possible because of my many replicate users, but this winds up being a bit of a problem now. There simply is not enough space for all of them to enter the room and attack. Even in a normal playthrough, this area is quite cramped, and so my unique unit composition has to some degree backfired. My first attempt at assaulting the sorcerer room is quite precarious. While the enemy sorcerers have relatively little defense, many of them do an incredible amount of damage, often sufficient to one-shot many of your squishier units. In addition, they are slightly scattered across the room, making it difficult to use Savage Blow at its maximum efficiency. But luckily, since Mosu's build is now finished, I can leverage an advantage I didn't think of previously: the Crescent Bow. In a normal playthrough, the Crescent Bow is a brave bow that has a significant penalty, which halves your strength or 1 combat after use. But since all my characters have 0 strength and half of 0 is 0, I suffer no such penalty. That said, the Crescent Bow's might is not very high, so even if I get attacked 4 times per round, I would struggle to do any damage with it. But as it turns out, by stacking tonics, meals, rallies, pair-ups, and plus 19 damage from skills, Mozu was able to assemble a massive damage stack, allowing her to quadruple in 1-round sorcerers. But unfortunately, she can't attack them safely because she'll get one-shot. In addition to this, Yamato, the generic sniper that I captured in chapter 23, has more or less an identical build to Mozu, allowing him to perform the same function. So by trading the Crescent Bow and transferring Arthur onto him, he is also able to 1-round sorcerers. This well-timed power bump allows me to nearly clear the room, but at the end, 2 enemies remain. There's a stationary maid and a Mjolnir sorcerer that I trapped in the corner. I'm quite nervous about this because Mjolnir is a killer tome with a high crit chance, and if I get crit, Naos could die. But then an entirely different disaster occurs, where Kaze just randomly dies because a maid one-shotted him with an entirely separate low probability crit that wasn't even on my radar. This isn't something I talked about a lot in these summaries, but Kaze is the one single unit that has been a disproportionate cause of resets for this playthrough. His pathetically low defense and comically low luck, even less than generic Master Ninjas, has caused no end of trouble for me. I'm pretty sure that no less than 20 resets have been a direct result of Kaze being one-shot because of his ridiculously fucking shitty stats. Are you fucking kidding me? How are you this bad? My next attempt at raiding the room goes a lot smoother, but with the additional practice from the previous attempt allowing me to execute much more advanced strategies. This time, I open by having Yamato one-round a sorcerer with the Crescent Bow, then transfer the Crest Bow and Arthur to Mozu, which, notably, also transfers some of the build-up shield gauge to her, allowing her to safely attack a sorcerer that could otherwise one-shot her, and then have Azura sing for Mozu to kill another sorcerer and then use a shelter and transfer to refresh Azura's action to sing again for Mozu to kill yet another sorcerer. I then use lunge multiple times to shove sorcerers over the wall, putting them in range of my other units that otherwise cannot attack this turn. With all of these more advanced moves, I cleared the room quite decisively, and I even managed to capture one of the maids for S-rank Befro Staff shenanigans on the final map. The final room on this map, adjacent to the Seize Point, contains a very large number of berserkers and generals, who are all incredibly tough and have a lot of HP. Moreover, fighting inside the room is a death sentence. There's not nearly enough space for me to use all my units, and the entire room is within the range of 2 free staff users as well as Iago staffs. So I decided to take the easy way out, which, as always, involves human sacrifice. The general I used to help me tank the first wave now doesn't really do much for me, so I have him break down the door, which is a slow process because he has 0 strength. While he does this, I have my entire army retreat to the starting room, which is the ideal staging ground for my defense, because the area is extremely open and is outside of enemy staff range. Once I'm prepared, I have the general break the door, and he is immediately beaten to death with hammers. 5 generals and 5 berserkers emerge from the room to attack me, and as they do, I make sure to block a reinforcement wave from the upper right stairs with my wyverns, after which I immediately use pair-ups to rocket boost them 16 tiles away in one turn. The second wave of reinforcements spawn, consisting of 3 sorcerers and a free staff maid who could be a big problem if they bunch up with the generals and berserkers. To stop the maid from freezing me, I exploit a quirk of the AI. Enemy status staff users would generally prefer to attack if possible, even if they could use their status staff, and I'm able to use this behavior to bait the maid into attacking Mozu, who immediately counterattacks and kills her. I continue backing off to pick off the 3 sorcerers before the main force arrives. I have everyone hide in the fringes of the room, just barely outside enemy ranges, ready to pounce. All of the enemies move in a single file line, which is not an ideal formation for me to attack into, but it's good enough. I'm actually able to one-round the berserkers because of the relatively low defense and resistance, and I use lunge to repeatedly reorganize the generals to maximize my movement options and to increase my savage blow damage. With further reorganizations, my savage blows increase in efficiency and cascade into continual kills on 1 HP enemies, and after a dozen savage blows are landed, the formerly formidable formation is reduced to ashes, leaving no trace of their existence behind. I then take a while to heal everyone up to full HP by using Azura's passive, as I have literally no money left for healing staff uses, and then move to take on Hans, who only has a few defenders left. Once you start fighting Hans, more generals and berserkers spawn as reinforcements from the bottom. These combined with the enemies in the room would form a similar force to the group that I just faced, but luckily most of these enemies can be easily blocked. I smuggle several of my units through enemy ranges to block through the 4 stair tiles, so only a single reinforcement spawns. The ensuing fight is so one-sided that is not worth elaborating on, and I kill Hans to take the Argomir, which despite being an S-rank weapon with high might, is not useful for me, because no one that is worth using can wield it. Now all that remains to complete the map is to defeat Iago, who is quite threatening because he wields the Excalibur tome and has a hefty crit chance. But unluckily for him, he wields a tome, meaning that Tomebreaker Duelist Bill Jacob can attack him in complete safety, because Iago will have 0 hit. Iago is slain, and I'm able to claim the treasure from the end of the map, which includes the Excalibur tome, 20,000 gold, an angelic robe, and the S-rank Bifrost staff, which can be used to resurrect a single character that has fallen on the current chapter. At this point, I have more or less completed the map, but my job isn't done. There is one critical piece of loot that I desperately need, which is the Spy Shuriken, the only 3-ranged weapon in this route. Unfortunately, it is guarded by Faceless and Stoneborn in the left room, which is perhaps one of the most deadliest rooms in the entire game. To reiterate, even in a normal playthrough, I never try attacking this room, and I cannot even dream of doing so with 0 strength and magic. But I don't need to defeat all the Stoneborn. All I need is to grab the treasure at the chest inside the room. There is probably a sneaky method that you can use with pass to sneak past all the enemies and then immediately seize, but I decided to use a much more tedious, but more importantly, much funnier strategy. Stoneborn have incredibly high defenses, crazy damage, and 1 to 5 range, but they do have one disadvantage: their abysmal move. Faceless can only move 5 tiles per turn, and Stoneborn can only move 4. Normally, retreating has some limits because eventually you run out of space, but this chapter is different because the map is structured like a circle, so I'm in a position where I can outrun low move enemies more or less indefinitely. So I crack open the Stoneborn room and let them move out. As I do this, even more Faceless and Stoneborn pour out of the stairs and begin to give chase. The size of the enemy group is now quite formidable and impossible to attack into, but fortunately I don't have to fight them. All I have to do is get all of them out of the room. I abuse my superior movement range to lead the Stoneborn and Faceless on an extended goose chase around the entire map. I continue backtracking, making sure to stay just barely on the edge of their range. I don't want to move too fast because then the enemy forces could split up and attack from both sides. And with some careful movement, I'm able to keep the entire enemy force in one huge lagging group that struggles to reach me. Eventually, the entire enemy force has chased me across the entire map, completely abandoning their original position, allowing me to swing around and get the Spy Shuriken without a fight. Now that all the enemies are grossly out of position, I'm able to quickly swing back around to the seize point, completely circumnavigating the entire map to escape before having to actually fight them. This completes the map, and with this strategy, I was able to get all of the treasure, completely bypassing the deadliest room in the game by using one of the most ridiculous strategies I've ever concocted. Chapter 27 of Conquest with 0 strength and magic is the penultimate map of the game, and in regular play, it's a pretty easy map. The objective is to defeat the boss, which is King Garen, who for various stupid reasons has turned into a horrifying goo monster. All of our units start pretty far away from Garen, and almost immediately 4 infinite rage and trap staff maids will kidnap your 4 strongest units to fight 1v1s in isolated rooms. Though the exact criteria for which units are entrapped is mysterious and I don't really know how it works. The general way to play this map is to funnel everyone through these side rooms and then use the stairs to get closer to Garen and immediately defeat him, dodging the aggressive enemies in the central hall. The units that end up being entrapped are Korin, Jacob, Mozu, and one of my many replicate poison strikers. Korin, Jacob, and Mozu are all generally strong enough to win their fights, but the poison striking unit is woefully under-equipped because they can't actually do lethal damage on their own. In most normal playthroughs, this map is basically a complete afterthought, and I start operating under the same logic. But what ensues is a frankly embarrassing series of events where I repeatedly get units killed for no real reason and have to constantly reset. One hurdle I wasn't expecting was that the weakest of my 4 entrapped units was often teleported into one of the farther away rooms, making it difficult to assist them. After a shameful number of failed attempts, I finally get a run working. I win 3 of the 1v1s immediately and get good RNG with my weaker unit being teleported to one of the closer rooms, allowing all my other units to pile into the chamber to assist. I rush everyone into the stairs to set up to fight Garen, and I open by having one of my Shuriken users attack to debuff him, but Garen decides to counter by instantly killing him with a 114 damage crit, forcing another reset. At this point, we are up to 199 resets for the entire run, and I take the time to do the entire map all over again, getting everyone set up right around Garen. This time, I open by having Korin attack with a recently upgraded Shadow Yato, dealing quite a bit of damage, and then dance to get the kill with a Dragon Fang activation, defeating Garen and leading us right into the endgame, which will be among one of the hardest maps I've ever played in any Fire Emblem challenge. In the endgame of Conquest with 0 strength and magic, we are up against our most significant challenge to date, which is defeating Takumi. This is one of the most difficult final maps in the entire entire Fire Emblem franchise, and even in normal playthroughs, most players can only get by using some sort of cheese strategy. On Lunatic difficulty, this is typically done by using the rescue staff to move a single unit to the boss to defeat him in one turn, and nearly all of my other Conquest playthroughs have used this method. I currently have all the tools needed to reach Takumi with the rescue strategy, but because all my units have 0 strength and magic, none of my units can defeat him in one round, which ruins everything. If you can't defeat Takumi in one round, then you almost invariably die on enemy phase, as all the surrounding enemies pile on you. Takumi is incredibly tanky, boasting 75 HP and the Dragon Skin skill, which halves all damage taken and further reduces bonus damage from skills and critical hits. Technically, it could be possible for me to defeat him in one round, even with 0 strength, if I get extremely lucky with critical hits and percent activation skills. The best bet for doing this would be to pile as many damage buffs as possible onto Korin, whose Shadow Yato can mitigate some of Dragon Skin's damage reduction effects. But even this low probability one round strategy has a minimum damage threshold to meet, and unfortunately, my current Korin build just not good enough to get this to work with any amount of reliability. Too many of my resources were tied up in other units that I needed to even get to this point in the run, and a considerable amount was also wasted on ideas that didn't really go anywhere. If I optimized the run from the start with perfect knowledge of how things would go, I could probably make Korin strong enough to one round Takumi semi-reliably, but for the most part, I've just been winging it as I go along, and redoing things really isn't an option. So frankly, at this point, Korin is not strong enough to defeat Takumi, making the rescue skip strategy a non-starter, which leaves very few options for completing the map, one of which is shockingly playing the map normally as originally intended by the developers. This is a ridiculous idea for many reasons, but at this point, it's the best option I have. In order to do this, I'll need to fight through an entire map filled with the strongest enemies in the game. Because of the unprecedented level of difficulty on this map, I did something I normally don't do, which is practice the map off stream before I try it live, and I found that this was definitely a good idea because it took nearly 20 hours of attempts and brainstorming to come up with a general plan that was even remotely workable. Let me begin by discussing strategies that were not at all viable because most of them weren't. My usual go-to strategy, which is turtling in the starting area, will not work because of a couple of reasons. Handling the first few batches of enemies is doable, but the reinforcement waves will soon become extremely overwhelming, making it impossible to push through the map while also dealing with the reinforcements. Since there are an infinite number of reinforcements on this map, you can't just wait them out. This causes map progress to come to a standstill, which is really bad because of the main map mechanic, where Takumi launches AoE attacks every other turn, dealing half max HP damage to all of your units. And these AoE attacks are even more effective against me because replicated units have shared HP pools, so they'll be hit twice for half max HP, reducing them to 1. This can be defended against by using Dragon Veins to block the AoE attacks, but there are a limited number of them, so if you stay still, you'll eventually run out of them and be wiped out. There are also many enemy staff users with infinite use Enfeeble staffs and inevitable end, causing stacking debuffs, which will further weaken my army as the battle drags on. Any battle of attrition is clearly not in my favor. In other words, I have to advance as far as possible, as quickly as possible, which is a lot to ask when all my units have 0 strength and 0 magic. After I work out a general rough plan, I execute it for the first time live on stream. My first priority is to get rid of status abusers as quickly as possible. On turn 1, I immediately move Mozu down to enemy range, saying for her to immediately snipe an enfeeble maid, and then I use one of my 4 precious rescue staff chargers to move her to safety. I shelter Azur to get her out of range and move all my units down, finishing my turn by having all my replicate units create their replicates, increasing my unit count from the normal maximum of 16 to 22. Since I'm not going for the rescue skip, I can afford to use my rescue charges offensively to snipe priority targets. On enemy phase, a squad of Oni chieftains move in, aided by Jacob, who is able to easily survive their attacks. This begins my second turn, and I quickly move to counter. The Oni chieftains are tanky, but luckily they have moved in a pretty packed formation, allowing me to savage blow them into submission. If they moved in separately, I would have a much harder time. Reinforcements also attack from the sides, heroes from the left and Onryoji from the right. Reinforcers are really hard to deal with on this map because they spawn on dark waters terrain, which is completely inaccessible to player units, even flyers. This means that these reinforcements are extremely difficult to intercept before they're ranged to attack. This doesn't give you many good options. You can either risk taking hits from incredibly strong enemies or wait until they move off the dark waters terrain. Taking hits unfortunately can risk death, while waiting is also not an option because being delayed even for a single turn can have significant consequences. So I take a third option, which is exclusively available from 3 range. This is why I went through a tremendous amount of trouble to get the the Spy Shuriken in Chapter 27. Some of these reinforcements are too far away to attack on this turn with conventional 1-2 range weaponry, but with the 3 range Spy Shuriken, you can attack them. The Spy Shuriken itself doesn't do much damage because the might is low and I have 0 strength, but it does allow you to activate pair-up attacks from increased range, and Mozu does enough damage with the Crescent Bow that her pair-up attacks are enough to significantly damage the faraway on Miyoji, and I'm lucky enough to defeat him with a critical hit. This allows him to move faster and clean up the reinforcement waves on the right, but I kind of mess up against the heroes on the left. And even worse, while I did set up protective walls to defend against Takumi's AoE, they don't protect units on left and rightmost columns, causing several units to be clocked for half their HP, resulting in the death of a replicate mechanist, which also causes his copy to die. This is pretty bad. It's already turn 2 and I've already lost 2 units. In any of my practice attempts, this will be sufficient cause to just restart, but since this was my first live attempt on stream, I just decided to go with it and try to get as far as I could. The next main challenge is a wall of 4 status staff maids and an overwhelming mix of generals, master ninjas, paladins, and malignites. I already managed to snipe one of the maids on turn 1, leaving only 3 left. On turn 3 of player phase, I cleaned up the remaining reinforcements from the previous turn and immediately moved to assassinate one of the maids. I moved Mozu down to kill one and then immediately burned a second rescue use to retreat and dance to kill a third maid, leaving only 1 left, after which I burned my third rescue to get back to safety. Having stripped the wall of status staff support, I moved to bait them to fight them on my own terms, but this is difficult to do safely and quickly, and I cannot afford to wait. Even worse, these enemies move in 2 separate groups which must be baited separately, increasing potential casualties. I use a mechanist to bait on the left and Yamato on the right. The mechanist is killed by a general and dies in the process, taking his copy with him, and Yamato gets powed by 3 enemies and dies. I begin turn 4 having already lost 5 units and immediately capitalize on his sacrifices to push even further towards Takumi, who looms ever closer. I have Mozu one-shot a tanky paladin with the Crescent Bow and then dance to do it again. I then take out the malignites by having my mechanist use bows with effective Mozu pair-up damage. I then have a generic maid I capture in Chapter 27 use the S-rank staff Bifrost to immediately revive Yamato, bring him back to life and give me back one of my strongest units. Unfortunately, because of my mounting casualties, I'm unable to wipe out the enemy forces and the generals prove too tanky to kill. Moreover, because of the stress of playing this live and having a lot of things go wrong, I straight up forget to guard against Takumi's AoE attack, and he launches a devastating energy wave that halves my entire army's HP, a potentially game-ending mistake. In the ensuing chaos, Azura is immediately killed as well as Kazik and Midori and their associated copies, losing me 5 units in 1 turn, bringing me down to 13 units out of the original 22. Again, in any practice run, this will be a sign to just give up, but since this is my first live attempt, I decided to keep going. Things aren't looking good as I start turn 5 with 9 casualties, which is made worse by the fact that the deadly reinforcements I was so worried about start appearing. 4 faces appear from the top, and 8 cavalry organized into 4 pairs enter from the bottom. These 8 cavalry are so tanky that it's nearly impossible for me to fight them cleanly even at full strength, and I'm not currently anywhere near full strength. But on the bright side, this attempt was already so scuffed that it gave me a boldness to experiment and try extremely risky strategies that I would never normally consider even in practice. At this point, we have already wildly diverged from any preparation I've done, and my mindset was one where I assumed I was already going to lose. It gets to the point where as I start the turn, I attack with Yamato, who I just revived, and he dies immediately to a critical hit, but I clicked so fast that the sound didn't play, so I didn't quite register that I got crit, and I wasn't even mad that it happened because I just assumed I made a mistake. At this point, I entered a zen state of desperation, or perhaps a scuffed nirvana. Things were so bad that I no longer felt influenced by the potential of future catastrophe, allowing me to identify a critical opening. After using 3 out of my 4 rescue charges to assassinate and enfeeble maids, I only have 1 rescue charge left. So I decided to make a Hail Mary play and try to move as many units to Takumi as possible in an effort to assassinate him before all my units die. Defeating Takumi with only 1 unit is not possible, but if I were to sacrifice my entire armor to get 3 or 4 units in a position, there is hope. So I start turn 5 by healing Korin and then pair Gunter up with her. I immediately use rescue to teleport Korin to get into attack range of Takumi. Unfortunately, I'm not anywhere near defeating him in 1 round, even with lucky skill and critical activations, so I'll have to do this over multiple turns. Fortunately, my efforts in attacking from the front have paid off because Takumi is now quite isolated. Rescue skip kills must be done in 1 turn, or otherwise units in previous lines of defense can move back to assist, but I've already dealt with them, albeit with significant casualties. And this leaves Takumi with surprisingly few defenders. The 3 great masses near him don't move, so they aren't an immediate threat. So this only leaves the 4 pairs of cavalry that just entered the field. If I can block them, I can buy time for Korin to have multiple solo rounds of combat with Takumi, which at this point is my only path to victory. And so I use all my remaining units to body block these 4 cavaliers, preventing them from assisting in Korin and Takumi's duel. The 4 pairs of cavaliers move in to clean up my army, and I almost immediately lose one of my Savage Roll mechanists, taking his copy with him, and Mozu managed to tank one hit with shield gauge before being killed by another attack. The remaining foes move upward, attacking my straggling units, killing a maid and rallyman, but luckily moving them away from Korin. All 3 of the Great Masters waste their status stabs on Jacob instead of Korin, leaving Korin in tip-top condition to fight Takumi, who almost always moves last in enemy phase turn order. Takumi attacks Korin, activating Vengeance for 0 bonus damage, and Korin counters with a Dragon Fang and a normal attack, barely managing to take out half his HP. Takumi doesn't have passive healing, the only nearby healer was distracted by Jacob, allowing this damage to stick. I begin turn 6 with only 7 units remaining and Takumi on half HP, giving me a tremendous number of actions to finish the job, but it might not be enough. Korin is the only one that can do any damage, and she's been debuffed by Takumi's Draconic Hex, reducing her speed to the point where she can no longer double. Not to mention, Takumi's shield gauge has built up, which will further reduce my damage output. Just as a side note, Poison Strike and Savage Blow will not work here, because Takumi's Dragon Skin skill completely nullifies out of combat damage. I start by moving in a generic Falconite to transfer away Gunter and use an Enfeeble Staff in the hopes of lowering Takumi's speed so Korin can double, but it misses, which is not good because I really needed that extra damage. At this point, I'm confident that things had never been more over, but I refuse to go down without a fight. I move Camilla to transfer Gunter over to hit Takumi to increase his shield gauge. Afterwards, Gunter immediately dies. Then I move Jacob to transfer himself over to Korin and attack with Camilla to peel off Takumi's shield gauge, but this also causes Camilla and her replicate to die. I also get an unexpected pair-up attack, which unexpectedly also builds Takumi's shield gauge. Now with the Jacob pair-up, Korin can double again, so I attack with Korin, getting a Dragon Fang on the first strike, but Takumi counters with Vengeance, which I luckily dodge. His own pair-up attack gets blocked, but I also builds a shield gauge, which surprisingly blocks my second hit. It seems my extra pair-up attack when I attack with Camilla has unexpectedly given him enough shield gauge to block my attacks. Things are extremely over at this point because Takumi can heal for half his HP by killing a unit on enemy phase with Life Taker, and if he heals at this point, I simply cannot win. Death looms over me as his AoE energy wave drains the last bit of HP from my remaining units, but suddenly, a miracle occurs. Arthur dies blocking the Dark Knights, and a quirk of the turn order works out to my benefit. Before Takumi can kill the Falcon Knight to heal himself, an enemy Bone Knight moves in first, because Takumi will always move near the end of enemy phase. This prevents Takumi from killing the Falcon Knight and self-healing and forces him to attack Korin. Korin blocks the attack with shield gauge and counter-attacks, landing a normal hit and a Dragon Fang, bringing Takumi down to 1 HP. Korin gets hit by an Enfeeble multiple times, but all of the remaining enemies are out of position and are too far away to assist. I begin my final player phase on turn 7 with only 2 units remaining, Korin and Jacob. Takumi is left exactly 1 HP, and is only 1 attack away from activating shield gauge, giving me just exactly enough to kill him. I attack with Korin with 100% accuracy, defeating Takumi and completing the endgame of Fire Emblem Fates Conquest with 0 strength and magic in my first live attempt with one of the narrowest margins of victory I've ever had in any of my playthroughs. This concludes my playthrough of Fire Emblem Fates Conquest on Lunatic difficulty with 0 strength and magic. At the start, I was unsure if this challenge was even possible, and I only did a bare minimum of testing for soft locks. But one thing led to another, and after 199 resets and 19 streams over the course of nearly half a year, I managed to complete the run with one of the most spectacular finishes of any of my playthroughs. This was definitely one of the hardest Fire Emblem challenges I've ever done, both in terms of map-by-map tactics as well as overall strategy, though it was nice to not play an Iron Man challenge for once, because I really enjoy the trial and error learning experience working through each of the maps in sequence. Playing Conquest with 0 strength and magic is probably one of the best challenges I've ever done, mainly because of how drastically my strategies and methodologies were forced to change because of the restrictions. The useful strategies and build choices that are strong in a 0 strength run are much different from that of a normal playthrough, and in fact, I was forced to develop and pioneer new strategies and build specifically for this run because no one's ever done this challenge before. It was pretty cool to be able to rely so heavily on strategies that are mediocre in normal play, but strong in this challenge. The Poison Strike and Savage Blow build I leaned into in the late game was run defining, and I really liked how it forced me to play the game much differently. In that way, I think a lot of challenge runs are really at their most interesting when you're treading new ground and doing something other people haven't done before. A great deal of the fun in Fire Emblem, in general, is the novelty of the experience. It's very likely that your first playthrough of the game will be the one you enjoy most, and doing such an extreme challenge run was definitely one way to recapture that feeling. More specifically, the process of concocting your own strategies and plans I think is one of the most fun parts about gaming in general. One thing that I didn't expect this challenge to do was that it forced me to play a lot of Conquest's challenging maps in more or less the intended way, especially the final map. Excessively long-term strategies are really only worth making if there's an adequately difficult obstacle to oppose it, and defeating Takumi by fighting through all of the enemies and sacrificing my entire army definitely meets that standard. And none of this would be possible if Fire Emblem Fates wasn't the amazing game that it is. It simply has so many interesting systems that all contribute to being able to create vastly different gameplay experiences. The sheer number of additional things they can do on each turn and each chapter really just allows for higher skill expression and varied outcomes, which I find fascinating. It's for this reason and many others that Fire Emblem Fates is probably among my favorite Fire Emblem games. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this challenge as much as I enjoyed making it. If you want to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing, becoming a YouTube member, or donating to my Patreon, or even just showing up when I stream. See you all in the next one. Bye.